Welcome back, drillers and heretics, to Grim. Tonight we're diving into a story and lore of Skulltaker, the Herald of Khorne. Before we get into the madness, be sure to like and comment on videos and topics you want to see in the future. Be sure to subscribe for the Emperor. I want to thank you guys for the support. I've been killing it like always. Now, let's get to the madness.
The sky was brass, and it burned. It did not shine with the light of stars. No clean radiance lived there, no cold celestial fire, no promise of dawn. It was a furnace vault stretched across eternity, hammered into shape by wrath and blackened at its edges by the smoke of unending war. Across that impossible firmament, butchered suns dragged themselves through clouds the color of clotted blood, each one bleeding light upon the killing fields below. Their heat did not warm, it judged, it scoured. It peeled weakness from flesh and soul alike, leaving only the hard thing beneath. Beneath that sky, the realm of Khorne stretched without horizon. Brass plains ran on forever, each league engraved by the drag marks of chains, the gouges of axes, the claw scrapes of beasts too vast and hateful to die for long. Rivers of blood cut through the metal earth in steaming torrents, their currents thick with helmets, broken swords, severed limbs, and the gnawed remains of warriors who had screamed their final oaths in a million forgotten tongues. Mountains rose beyond the plains, not of stone, but of skulls, human skulls, Astartes skulls, orc skulls like slabs of bone, Eldar skulls with elegant ruins where arrogant eyes had once glared. The skulls of beasts, mutants, tyrants, kings, prophets, witches, champions and cowards. All were gathered, all were judged, all were stacked beneath the gaze of the blood god. There was no peace there. Peace was a lie told by weak empires to preserve trembling throats. There was only war made pure. The clangor of it was existence itself. Blades struck blades. Blades struck bone. Axes split helms and the skulls beneath. Brass hooves crushed ribs into wet cages of splintered ivory. Bloodletters shrieked praise and hatred as they butchered their own kind beside the rivers, their lean forms slick with gore, their hellblades glowing red from use. Somewhere far away, a bloodthirster roared, and the sound rolled across the plains like a collapsing fortress. Demon engines answered with smoke-belching howls. Chains rattled. Skulls tumbled. The rivers hissed as fresh blood joined ancient blood and lost all memory of the body that had carried it. From that sound, from that heat, from that law, Uzzul was born. He did not wake as mortals woke. There was no mother, no breath, no dark womb, no first cry, no confusion of infant senses. He was wrenched into being by rage. He was pulled from the red violence between heartbeats, shaped by martial hatred, hammered by the desire to kill and judged worthy enough to exist for the span of his first battle. Brass heat sealed muscle over sinew. Warp fire licked blackened bone. A skull face pushed from the wet ruin of forming flesh, horned and murderous, its eyes opening as pits of hot red malice. His first breath was not air, it was the reek of blood steaming on iron. His first thought was not a word, it was the knowledge of murder. He stood upon a plain of hot brass, naked save for the red ruin of his own demonic flesh and the weapon that had formed with him. The blade was in his grasp before memory had shape, curved, cruel, eager. Its edge smoked where droplets of his own birth blood hissed away into nothing. His fingers tightened around the grip with the certainty of something older than learning. The weapon belonged in his hand. The battlefield belonged beneath his feet. The skulls belonged before him, waiting to be taken. Around him, the slaughter did not pause. A bloodletter was ripped open by another of its breed, black entrails spilling over brass as the victor stamped on the fallen demon's throat, and hacked until the head came free. Another pair fought knee-deep in one of the blood rivers, each trying to drag the other beneath the surface while stabbing upward through the churn. Beyond them, a pack of red-skinned killers drove jagged blades into a creature of their own kind that had fallen too slowly, punishing weakness with the only mercy Khorne permitted. Uzzul watched, not with wonder, not with fear, with assessment. A shadow fell across him. The bloodletter that approached was taller, older, its horns carved with kill runes and its hide scarred by battles that had ended worlds. Bits of dried flesh hung between its teeth. It carried a hell blade in both hands, the weapon nicked and stained from slaughter beyond counting. Around its neck swung a chain of finger bones and broken teeth, pathetic tokens from unworthy prey, yet enough to mark the creature as one that had survived longer than many. It leaned close, sniffing the newborn demon's face, its lips peeled back from black fangs. Little blood, it snarled in the battle cant of the murderborn. Fresh meat, fresh shame. Kneel, bleed, serve. The words struck the air like thrown knives. Around them, several bloodletters paused in their killing long enough to watch. Not from curiosity. Curiosity was a mortal weakness. They watched because challenge had weight. Dominance had meaning. A newborn thing would be broken, or it would break another. Either answer would be pleasing if there was blood enough in the asking. Uzzul made no reply. The older demon laughed, a sound like a saw drawn through a spine. It raised its blade, perhaps to maim, perhaps to mark, perhaps merely to make the newborn creature flinch. Uzzul moved first. There was no flourish, no cry, no declaration. His blade rose in a single red arc and passed through the challenger's neck with a sound like wet leather tearing over bone. The head came away cleanly. For the span of a heartbeat, the older bloodletter's body remained upright, its weapon still lifted, its muscles refusing to accept the truth of death. Then black blood burst from the stump in a scalding fan. The body fell hard upon the brass plane, twitching, talons clawing once at nothing. The severed head struck the ground and rolled. Its eyes still burned, its jaws still snapped, its tongue spat curses without breath. It rolled across the engraved brass, leaving a thick smear behind it, until it came to rest against a heap of skulls cracked open for sport. The watching bloodletters erupted, not in horror, in frenzy. They howled, they beat blades against breastbones, they tore at their own hides and flung ropes of blood into the air. Some hurled themselves at one another, overcome by the need to answer murder with murder. One leapt upon the fallen body and began hacking it apart, not out of hunger, but in celebration. Another seized the still snapping head and lifted it toward the burning sky before Uzzul's blade took its hand at the wrist. The maimed demon shrieked and staggered back. Uzzul reached down, took the severed head by one horn and pulled it from the twitching fingers that had dared touch his first trophy. The frenzy deepened. Murder was language there. Murder was greeting, oath, insult, prayer, and proof. In the realm of Khorne, existence did not ask who had been born. It asked who had killed. Uzzul had answered before he had spoken. The answer pleased the battlefield. Then the sky darkened. It did not dim. Dimming was a soft thing, a mortal thing, a candle guttering in a shrine. The brass vault above the plain clenched. The butchered suns bled harder. The rivers boiled, casting up steam that smelled of marrow and rust. Across the killing fields, demons faltered mid-strike. Not from fear as mortals knew fear, but from the sudden pressure that fell upon them all. The attention of Khorne descended. It was not a voice. The blood god did not need syllables to command. Speech was for generals explaining weakness, for priests hiding cowardice beneath ornamented lies, for kings begging obedience from lesser men. Khorne's will was a weight that crushed the soul into the shape he desired. It wrapped around every throat like a chain of heated iron. It pressed into every skull like a gauntlet seeking to close. Uzzul felt it and did not kneel. He stood with his first trophy hanging from his fist, black blood dripping over his claws. The pressure drove through him. It measured him. It weighed the kill, the speed, the silence, the absence of hesitation. It searched for softness and found none. It searched for doubt and found nothing that could bear the name. The head in his grip stopped cursing. Every bloodletter nearby bowed without bowing, lowering blades, lowering horns, their bodies shaking beneath the unseen judgment. Across the plain, the rivers threw up bubbles of red froth. Skulls rolled loose from distant mountainsides and rattled down in avalanches, as though the realm itself shifted beneath its master's gaze. In that pressure, Uzzul learned the first law. Every skull had value. Only worthy skulls had meaning. The head in his hand was a beginning, nothing more. It had been strong enough to challenge, not strong enough to endure. Worth existed in degrees. Some skulls were grit beneath the hooves of juggernauts. Some were coined for the blood god's endless tithe. Some were offerings worthy of brass spikes before the throne itself. The newborn demon understood without teaching that his existence would be measured not by how many throats he opened, but by which heads he carried when the killing ceased. If it ever ceased. A blade struck his shoulder from behind. The edge bit deep, carving through red hide and opening him to the heat beneath. Pain came as revelation, not punishment, not warning, proof. Uzzul turned into the blow, letting the weapon tear free in a spray of molten blood. The attacker, another bloodletter, lunged with a shriek, its jaws wide enough to show the black root of its tongue. Uzzul smashed his first trophy into the attacker's face. Bone burst, horn cracked. The demon reeled, blinded by another creature's skull. Uzzul stepped close and drove his blade through its belly, ripping upward until organs and warp-hot viscera spilled across his forearms. The attacker tried to bite him. Uzzul caught its lower jaw and tore until the mouth split wide beyond its skull's design. Then the blade fell again, and another head struck the brass. The pit war began without command. Bloodletters came at him in twos and threes, then in shrieking knots of red flesh and iron blades. They did not unite. Unity was a tool for weaker beings. They collided with him and with each other, each desperate to be the one that killed the newborn, whose first act had drawn the gaze of the blood god. The brass plane became an arena without walls. Gore slicked the engraved metal beneath their taloned feet. Severed limbs twitched and clawed across the ground. Heads bounced, rolled, snapped and cursed until they were crushed beneath the press of battle. Uzzul learned as he killed. A heavy stroke could be allowed to pass close if it opened the throat beneath the raised arm. A leaping foe could be split before it landed if the blade met the spine below the ribs. Horns could be seized. Tongues could be torn out. Knees could be cut backward. Bellies opened quickly, but skulls mattered. Always the skull, always the head. A body might thrash for a time without one, but its worth ended the moment bone parted from neck. He took wounds, many. A hellblade scored his ribs and spilled fire from him in red sheets. Talons raked his back, peeling strips of demonic hide that slapped wetly against his thighs. One foe drove a jagged point through his side and out the other. Uzzul trapped the weapon there with his own flesh, stepped forward along its length, and head-butted the attacker hard enough to cave its face inward. While it staggered, he sawed through its neck with short, brutal strokes, until the head came loose in his hand. The watching demons howled louder, the rivers boiled higher. Somewhere beyond the immediate carnage, war drums began to sound, vast drums, beaten by things chained to towers of brass. Their rhythm was not music, it was the pulse of execution. It rolled over the battlefield and entered the limbs of every demon that heard it. Bloodletters threw themselves harder into the slaughter. The dying clawed upward, desperate to kill before their forms dissolved. Those too wounded to stand dragged themselves by their elbows, biting at ankles, gnawing at fallen throats, refusing stillness. Uzzul stood at the heart of it. He was no longer cleanly born. He was drenched. His own blood mingled with the blood of those he had beheaded. His blade smoked. His hands were full of trophies until he could hold no more, and still he killed. He began to cast lesser heads aside, rejecting those that meant nothing. The act enraged the others. It also drew them. They came seeking to prove that their skulls deserved his grip. Most did not. He broke one demon's sword arm at the elbow, spun beneath the returning bite, and cut through the neck from behind. He kicked another into a third, impaling both upon the same fallen blade before taking their heads in separate strokes. A horned brute with a chest broad as an altar charged him, roaring praise to the skull throne. Uzzul met the charge by stepping inside the arc of its weapon and driving his blade under the chin. The point punched up through the skull. The brute's eyes burst in sprays of black fluid. Uzzul wrenched the weapon sideways, splitting the head apart from jaw to crown. At last, the circle widened. Not because mercy had entered the realm. Not because the bloodletters had tired. Demons of Khorne did not tire in the way mortals understood. The circle widened because the nearest challengers were dead, dismembered, crawling, headless, or reduced to red ruin beneath the newborn's feet. Those beyond the ring snarled and clashed their blades, but they did not immediately advance. A truth had been carved into the brass plane, and even rage could read it. Uzzul stood alone in a mound of bodies. Headless corpses knelt, sprawled and twitched around him like offerings arranged by a mad priest. Blood ran in channels between his talons. Steam rose from his wounds. In one hand he held the first skull, stripped now of its lower jaw, its eyes finally dark. In the other he held his blade, its edge choked with gore and smoking scraps of demon flesh. Far across the impossible distance of the realm, beyond rivers of blood and mountains of skulls, beyond the war plains and the chained foundries and the arenas where champions butchered one another for the right to be noticed, the brass citadel rose. No mortal mind could have held the sight of it and remained whole. Its walls were higher than hive spires, broader than mountain ranges, built of brass blackened by the heat of eternal war. Skulls covered it in numbers beyond counting, mortared into towers, nailed to gates, impaled upon spikes that vanished into the red clouds. Rivers of blood flowed from beneath its walls in cataracts. At its heart, unseen yet known, the skull throne waited beneath the shadow of the blood god. Uzzul lifted his first trophy toward that fortress. He did not speak. The realm understood. The skull was not enough. No skull would ever be enough. That was the blessing. That was the curse. That was the only purpose worth bearing. Beneath the brass sky, the newborn murderer stood among the headless dead, and the name that would one day make champions taste ash before battle had not yet been given to him. But the path had opened, and it was paved in skulls. Centuries passed in slaughter, though centuries meant little in the realm that fed upon rage. Uzzul learned time by the drying of blood on his blade. by the stacking of skulls, by the number of challengers who came snarling and ended silent. There were no seasons beneath the brass sky. No winter softened the stink of the rivers. No dawn promised renewal. No night offered concealment to cowards. There was only the eternal furnace glow of Khorne's realm, and the endless rhythm of war drums beaten by chained things that had once been kings. He killed beneath that rhythm. A mortal champion in blackened plate came first in memory, though not first in truth. The man had worn a crown made from the finger bones of his conquered tribe, and carried a two-handed axe inscribed with the names of brothers he had murdered for power. He had screamed to the blood god for witness as Uzzul approached across a field of burning corpses. His scream ended when Uzzul split him from collar to groin, waited for him to fall apart, then took the skull only after the man tried to drag his own entrails back into his body and stand again. That one had taught endurance. A demon rival came next, a horned murderer spawned from the same red wrath, swollen by victories over lesser bloodletters and mad with the belief that size was proof of favour. It charged through a storm of embers, hellblade raised high, roaring promises of dominion. Uzzul did not meet strength with strength. He stepped aside, cut the tendon behind the knee, removed the creature's weapon hand, and left it shrieking on the brass for long enough that every watching demon understood the lesson. The head came away only after the rival had learned helplessness. That one had taught humiliation. An alien war leader died beneath a sky that was not brass but ash grey, on a world pulled half into the immaterium by the prayers of its own doomed defenders. It had possessed 4 arms, a skull elongated beneath a crest of bone, and eyes like polished black stones. It moved with the arrogance of a thing that had never known equal prey. Uzzul severed each arm in turn. The alien tried to retreat after the second. It tried to bargain after the third. After the fourth, it made no sound at all. Uzzul crushed its throat with his foot and took the skull while its warriors watched from behind their shattered banners. That one had taught spectacle. A mutant king died on a throne of tank hulls, his bloated body wired into engines that pumped combat narcotics through veins as thick as cables. He commanded an army of twisted men, brass-branded and fever-eyed, each howling for skulls they had neither earned nor understood. Uzzul walked through them as though crossing tall grass. When the king begged Khorne to save him, Uzzul paused. The pause was not mercy. It was judgment. Then the blade fell, and the king's great head rolled down the steps of his throne, bouncing from plate to plate until it struck the mud at the feet of his kneeling soldiers. That one had taught contempt. Oath-sworn duelists came in pairs, in circles, in companies wearing matching scars and carrying blades cooled in sacred blood. Some were mortals, some were demons, some were things from beyond mortal naming, armoured in chitin, iron, bone, or faith. They announced themselves with titles. They recited lineages. They invoked gods, ancestors, empires, dead masters, and living oaths. Uzzul listened when they were worthy. He allowed the strongest the dignity of being seen. Then he killed them in ways their followers would remember until madness or death took memory from them. Each skull altered him, not in the crude manner of flesh swelling upon flesh or horn growing from horn. Lesser demons mistook accumulation for ascension. They measured themselves by how loudly they screamed, how many bodies they trampled, how much blood matted their hides, blood letters butchered in masses, rank upon rank of red murder, a tide of blades hurled into the meat of the foe. Heralds commanded slaughter, their will lashing the hordes into killing shapes. their voices cracking across battlefields like whips made from thunder. Bloodthirsters were something greater and more terrible, winged ruin given form, war made godlike, rage vast enough to break cities beneath a single landing. Uzzul became neither tide nor commander nor storm. He became a narrower thing, sharper. Where others drowned armies, he sought the throat from which the army drew its courage. Where others roared for blood, he watched for the champion who stepped forward when all lesser warriors stepped back. Where others hacked until nothing moved, he learned to make killing into declaration. A coward received no right. A coward died in passing, opened from spine to sternum, his skull kicked aside for lesser things to gather. Worth was different. Worth deserved witness. Worth deserved the blade's full attention. Worth deserved the long moment when fear, hatred, and defiance met the knowledge that they would not be enough. So, Uzzul hunted champions. The tally grew. He did not count as mortals counted. He knew the number because Khorne knew the number, and what the blood god knew burned through his servants as command. Skulls hung from chains at his waist, skulls blackened by flame, skulls plated in gold, skulls cracked by psychic fire, skulls taken from warlords, killers, champions, beast kings, blade masters, and oathbreakers who had believed themselves chosen until Uzzul proved otherwise. Many were offered, many were discarded. Only the worthy remained in memory, and memory itself became another blade. The 888th skull waited upon a demon world named Varrock's Moor, by the slaves who died there, and by no one else who mattered. The world hung inside a wound in reality, half real space, half nightmare. Its continents were scabbed with fortresses. Its oceans had boiled away into red fog. Its moons were chained together by impossible links of black iron, each link large enough to hold a hive city in its curve. Across the plains marched millions of damned soldiers under banners stitched from flayed flesh. They had once been imperial. Their armor still bore the ghost of Aquilus beneath layers of gore, brass studs, and devotional scars. Their tanks crawled like beetles through fields of bones. Their artillery fired shells packed with teeth and plague-rusted nails. Their priests had cut out their tongues to better hear the drums of the warp. At their head ruled High Marshal Dregor Vane. He had been a conqueror before damnation. He had been a butcher after it. Now he stood encased in relic tactical dreadnought plate, stolen from the corpse vaults of a murdered chapter and remade by warpsmiths until it resembled a walking shrine to defiance. His armor was the color of old iron and clotted blood. Chains hung from its shoulders, each one suspending the helm of a commander he had slain. His right hand carried a chain blade as tall as a mortal man, its teeth fashioned from the jawbones of executed rivals. His left bore a shield of layered plasteel, ceramite and demon brass, its face engraved with the names of cities burned at his command. Vane did not kneel to demons. That made his skull worth taking. Uzzul came through the red fog without herald or horn. The armies noticed him only when the killing began. The first rank died without understanding. Men in spiked rebreathers raised laser guns, autoguns, chain axes, and crude blades. Uzzul passed through them as a red cut in the world. Heads lifted from necks, arms spun free, bodies opened and spilled steaming loops of viscera onto ash churned black by boots. A sergeant barked an order into a vox grill before Uzzul's blade entered his mouth and burst through the back of his helm. Heavy stubbers turned. Flamers vomited lines of burning promethium. Uzzul walked through the fire, flesh sizzling, eyes fixed upon the distant silhouette of the High Marshal's command dais. Vayne saw him. Across the plain, atop a platform of skulls and tank armor, the High Marshal raised his chainblade in salute. "Demon," Vayne voxed, his amplified voice rolling through the command frequencies and across the external speakers mounted in the throats of his banner-bearers. "You walk into the guns of Draegr Vayne. Come then, let the blood god witness which of us has earned his gaze." Uzzul gave no answer. The elite guard moved to meet him. They were not common soldiers. They were Vayne's oath-locked killers, each one remade by surgery, pact, and battlefield survival. They wore armor of black iron and brass-rimmed ceramite. Some carried storm shields bearing screaming faces bound into the metal. Some bore chain blades, power mauls, hooked axes, or rotary cannons fed by belts of rune-stamped shells. Their banners snapped in the furnace wind, each standard topped by a skull dipped in molten bronze. Brass horns wailed from behind them, a deep and grinding note that vibrated through bone and armor alike. Uzzul entered their formation as a surgeon enters flesh. The first shield-bearer braced behind a slab of demon-etched metal, boots sinking into the ash. Uzzul did not batter through the shield. He cut low, removing both legs at the knees, then took the head as the warrior toppled forward. A chainblade howled from the right. Uzzul let it bite into his shoulder, trapping the teeth in demonic muscle, then tore the weapon from its wielder's hands and drove his own blade through the man's throat. A cannon roared. Shells struck Uzzul's chest, burst through red flesh, and hammered blood across the air behind him. He advanced through the barrage until he reached the gunner and opened him from hip to opposite shoulder. The guard tightened. They knew discipline, they knew fear, and had buried it beneath oaths. Their shields overlapped, their mauls crackled, their blades screamed. For a moment, they were almost worthy as a body. Not one skull among them shone bright enough for remembrance, but together they made a gate of violence before their lord. Uzzul broke the gate. He hooked a shield down with one horn and punched his blade through the visor behind it. He kicked another warrior backward, hard enough to crush the chest of the man behind him. He seized a banner pole, snapped it, and drove the jagged end through the throat of its bearer before tearing the banner free and casting it into the blood mud. A power maul struck his ribs and caved them inward. Uzzul answered by headbutting the wielder until the helm split and the face inside became pulp. He left the body standing for 3 heartbeats before removing its skull. By the time he reached the command dais, the elite guard lay in pieces behind him, their shields overturned, their banners drowning in gore, their chain blades still snarling against the ground where severed hands gripped them in death. High Marshal Draegr Vayne descended to meet him. The warlord's Terminator plate shook the skull steps with every stride. His helm was a snarling iron death mask with a crown of backward curving horns. Red optics burned within the slits. The chainblade in his fist screamed awake, each tooth spinning with hungry metallic rage. His shield locked into place with a crash of pistons. The armies fell back, not out of mercy, not out of reverence alone. They fell back because even the damned understood that some killings required space. Vayne struck first. He was faster than his bulk promised. The chain blade came down in a thunderous arc that would have split an armored transport. Uzzul slipped aside, but the edge clipped his left horn and sent fragments of blackened bones spinning into the air. Vayne turned with the blow, shield smashing outward. It caught Uzzul across the chest and hurled him down the skull steps, his body striking hard enough to burst old craniums beneath him. The armies roared. Vayne advanced. "Bleed then," the High Marshal growled. "Bleed and know that I have killed greater things than you." Uzzul rose. He touched the broken place where his horn had been marked. His fingers came away slick with blood and powdered bone. The wound was small. The meaning was not. The mortal had struck him. The mortal had marked him before the watching dead, the damned, the demonic, and the unseen gaze beyond the sky. For the first time in the duel, Uzzul inclined his head, not in submission, in acknowledgement. Then he attacked. Vayne met him with shield and roaring teeth. The first exchange shattered skulls beneath their feet. The second sent sparks bursting from the shield's face as Uzzul's blade carved a line through the engraved names of dead cities. The third drew blood from Varn, where the demon's edge found the joint beneath his arm. The High Marshal answered with a kick that broke the bodies of the fallen into paste and drove Uzzul back a step. They circled. Around them, millions watched in silence, broken only by engines, distant artillery, and the wet patter of blood dripping from the dais. Uzzul heard Vayne's breathing through his vox grill, harsh and amplified. He smelled the man inside the armor, sweat, blood, old pain, pride, the stink of a soul that had damned itself willingly and still believed damnation was a throne, worthy. The chainblade came again. Uzzul let it pass close enough to Flen's skin from his ribs. He stepped inside the reach and cut Vayne's left thigh. Ceramite split. Black-red blood poured. Vayne grunted, turned the sound into a snarl, and smashed his shield into Uzzul's face. Bone cracked. Blood sprayed across the shield's blasphemous engravings. Uzzul staggered, then laughed without voice, a breathless exhalation of murder. Vayne heard it. The High Marshal charged. Uzzul waited until the last instant, then dropped low and carved through the damaged thigh joint. Vayne's left leg buckled. The massive warlord fell to one knee, the impact shaking the dais. His chainblade swept sideways in desperation. Uzzul leapt over it, landed upon the shield, and drove his blade down through Vayne's wrist assembly. The shield arm came away in a burst of cables, blood, and torn metal. Vayne roared, not fear, rage. He swung the chain blade one-handed. Uzzul caught the forearm beneath the elbow and held it there, demonic sinews straining against relic servos. Teeth screamed inches from his skull. The High Marshal leaned into the weapon with all the strength of armor, hatred, and pride. Uzzul spoke then, not loudly, not for the armies, for the skull. The 8 words of sacrifice left his mouth in the tongue that burns meaning from lesser minds. No mortal throat could have shaped them. No mortal scripture could have held them. They were not written in sound alone, but in intent, in judgment, in the ancient contract between slaughter and offering. Men nearby fell to their knees with blood running from their ears. Vox units screamed and died. Banners caught fire without flame. Vayne heard enough to understand he had become tribute. "No," the High Marshal spat through broken speakers. "I am Dregor Vayne. I command millions. I have burned worlds. I have broken saints. I will not be your offering." Uzzul tore off his weapon arm. The chain blade fell silent as it struck the skulls below. Vayne lurched, trying to rise on his remaining leg, trying to crush the demon beneath his weight, trying still to make the duel into conquest. Uzzul stepped behind him and cut the other leg from beneath the armor. The High Marshal crashed forward, a fortress collapsing in the shape of a man. Still he lived. Still he cursed. That was why the skull mattered. Uzzul planted one clawed foot upon the back of the fallen warlord's helm and pulled the head back by its horned crown. His blade rested against the throat seal. For a moment, he allowed Vayne to see the armies that had followed him, the banners that had borne his name, the millions of damned soldiers who now watched their master reduced to meat inside broken plate. Humiliation, challenge, patience, spectacle. Then the blade moved. The head came free in a flood of blood, sparks and severed cables. Uzzul lifted it high, helm and skull together, the relic metal still snarling with dying machine spirits. Across Varrak's Moor, the armies did not cheer. They did not charge. They did not flee. They felt the weight of the moment press down upon them as the 888th worthy skull was offered beneath a wounded sky. The world shook. The red fog folded inward. The blood rivers reversed their flow. The brass horns of Vayne's dead guard gave one last note without breath to sound them. Above the diamond world, the wound in reality opened wider, and beyond it waited the furnace glare of Khorne's realm. Uzzul held the skull and felt the blood god's will descend. It was heavier than before, crueler, more exacting. It did not praise as mortals praised. It seized. It claimed. It wrapped around Uzzul's limbs, around his blade, around the trophy in his hand, and dragged him from the corpse-strewn dais as though the battlefield itself had become a chain. The damned soldiers fell away beneath him. Vayne's broken body vanished into red mist. The demon world folded into screams. Brass replaced ash beneath his feet. The sky became the color of slaughtered suns once more. Far ahead, a pit opened in the realm of rage. Its edges were lined with skulls. Its depths rang with the clash of blades. Around it waited the champions of the bloodletter legions, every one of them carved by endless war, every one eager to prove that Uzzul's tally ended with them. The 888th skull hung from his fist. The skull pit called, and Uzzul went toward it without hesitation. The skull pit opened beneath the brass sky, like a wound too vast for any mortal world to bear. It was not an arena in the sense that men understood arenas. It had no walls built for spectators, no measured ground, no ordered gates from which combatants entered beneath the cheers of lesser creatures. It was a continent torn open in the realm of Khorne, a crater of black brass and compacted bone, whose far rim vanished beyond horizons of smoke. Towers rose around it, each one forged from molten metal and mortared with skulls, each crowned by iron braziers that burned with blood instead of flame. Bone chains thicker than hive spires descended from the darkened sky and vanished into the pit, groaning under the weight of things chained below, things that bellowed praise and hatred in voices that shook the teeth in dead skulls. Demonic war engines crawled around the rim in endless procession. Brass scorpions dragged their blades through rivers of gore. Skull cannons rolled upon wheels made from fused vertebrae, their muzzles vomiting smoke that took the shape of screaming faces. Juggernauts stamped and snorted, their iron hides slick with blood, their eyes burning with the blind rage of beasts born only to crush. Bloodletters filled the slopes in red multitudes, howling, hacking at one another, trampling the fallen, tearing trophies from the weak before they had even stopped moving. Above them all, the sky beat like a flayed heart. Uzzul entered alone. He carried no banner. He needed none. He wore no crown. Crowns were for kings who required reminders that obedience had once been given to them. His proof hung from his fist and dragged at his side in a sack made from the cured hide of a slain demon champion. The sack was swollen with trophies, stretched near bursting by skulls worthy enough to bear witness. Among them rested the 888th, still locked within the severed helm of High Marshal Dregor Vane, its cracked vox grille forever silent, its iron crown bent by the grip that had torn it from its body. The bloodletter legions saw him. Their howls changed. It was not welcome. It was not hatred alone. It was recognition sharpened into challenge. The champions of Khorne's own Murderborn had gathered because the blood god had willed it. They were not mortal heroes who wore courage like a cloak over fear. They were not alien duelists hiding fragility behind speed and elegance. They were not tyrants fattened on command. These were bloodletter champions, veterans of endless wars beneath the brass sky and beyond it, creatures that had bathed in the blood of saints and demon princes, killers who had survived where survival itself was taken by blade and claw. They waited in the pit. Uzzul descended. Each step took him deeper into the judgment of his god. The brass beneath his talons was engraved with kill runes, all of them half buried by old blood. Skulls cracked beneath him. Some screamed as they broke. Some laughed. Some whispered the names they had carried in life and were ignored. The air grew heavier with every stride, hotter, thicker, packed with the pressure of a gaze that did not need eyes. At the base of the slope, the first champion came for him. It was immense for one of the Murderborn, swollen by victories and pride, its shoulders broad as a dreadnought sarcophagus, its horns plated in black iron. It carried a cleaver rather than a blade, a brutal wedge of demon metal with chunks of old flesh cooked onto its edge. The champion roared and charged straight through a mound of corpses, scattering limbs and skulls, its feet punching dents into brass. Uzzul did not roar back. The cleaver came down, heavy enough to split a battle tank. Uzzul stepped beneath the arc and cut once across the inside of the champion's right knee. The great demon stumbled, momentum ruining its strength. Uzzul turned with it and opened the back of the other knee. The champion crashed forward, still trying to swing from the ground. Uzzul placed one foot between its shoulders, took one horn in his hand, and drew his blade across the throat until the head came free in a black spray. The crowd shrieked approval and rage. The second champion did not wait for the corpse to fall still. It was swift, almost beautiful in its ugliness, narrow-limbed and blade-thin, its skin a darker crimson than the others, its horns swept back like the spines of a hunting beast. It moved in flickers, crossing the ground in jagged angles, striking and withdrawing, its hellblade darting toward eyes, throat, wrists, joints. It sought the wound that would matter. It sought to prove that speed could humble purpose. Uzzul let it cut air. The swift one struck from the left. Uzzul turned his shoulder and allowed the edge to scrape sparks from the trophy chains at his side. It came from the right, lower this time, aiming for the tendon. Uzzul lifted his foot and stamped down on the flat of the blade, pinning it to the ground. The swift champion abandoned the weapon and leapt for his throat with talons outstretched. Uzzul caught it by the face. For a breath, its limbs thrashed around him, claws carving shallow red marks across his hide. Then he slammed it into the brass floor. The first impact shattered its jaw. The second broke one horn. The third ruined the back of its skull. Uzzul drew his blade and removed the head before the body stopped clawing at him. A third came mounted. The brass beast beneath it was not a true juggernaut of the greatest stock, but it was still a monster of iron muscle and furnace rage. Its hooves crushed skulls into paste. Its nostrils vented sparks. Its rider carried a hooked lance made from fused femurs and black steel, the weapon long enough to impale Uzzul before his blade could answer. Around its neck hung the skulls of rival riders. Around its saddle, lesser faces had been nailed alive into the metal and left to scream themselves hollow. The rider lowered the lance. The beast charged. Uzzul stood motionless until the ground shook beneath him. The lance came for his chest. He turned at the last instant, letting the point pass close enough to tear a line across his ribs. His free hand seized the haft. The force dragged him backward, talons gouging long furrows in the brass. The mounted champion snarled triumph. Uzzul pulled. The rider had expected resistance. It had not expected command. The lance wrenched sideways. The brass beast's charge veered, one hoof striking a mound of skulls and slipping in the wet ruin beneath. Its weight pitched. Uzzul drove his blade up as it passed, not at the rider, but at the beast's throat. Demon iron and sinew parted. Molten blood flooded out. The mount collapsed mid-stride, ploughing into the ground with enough force to break its rider beneath it. The champion tried to crawl, free. Uzzul climbed onto the dying beast, walked across its convulsing flank, and looked down at the pinned rider. The champion spat curses through broken fangs. Uzzul answered by severing the head and kicking it into the sack with the others. The fourth came laughing with paired hellblades. Its arms moved without rhythm, crossing and uncrossing in patterns meant to confuse, each weapon tracing red fire through the air. It bowed mockingly before it attacked, though mockery in that place was merely another form of violence. Its blades clashed against Uzzul's in a storm of sparks. It struck high and low at once, forcing lesser killers to choose which wound to accept. Uzzul chose neither. He stepped inside the crossing blades, taking the cut of one across his shoulder as nothing worth noticing, and drove his forehead into the champion's face. Bone cracked. The paired blades faltered. Uzzul caught one wrist, twisted until the joint tore loose, then used the stolen arm and blade to block the second strike. The champion shrieked, more outraged than hurt. Uzzul cut off its remaining hand. Then he cut off both arms at the shoulder. The paired hellblades fell beside the twitching limbs that had held them. Only then did he take the head. The fifth did not come alone. It stood upon a heap of bodies at the far edge of the pit, taller than its followers, its horns carved with runes of command, its eyes like coals buried deep in sockets of bone. Around it gathered lesser bloodletters in a frothing pack, each one eager to die if its death opened a path for its master. The champion raised its blade and shrieked a command. The pack charged. They came as a red wave. Uzzul advanced into them. This was not duelcraft. This was butchery. Blades hammered against his own. Talons clawed at his limbs. Teeth snapped at his throat. He killed without waste. A head taken here, a spine open there, a hand removed before its blade could descend, a horn seized and used to wrench one demon into the path of another's strike. Lesser bloodletters died piled around him, their bodies split, gutted, beheaded, crushed beneath his steps. Their master remained behind them, waiting, using their deaths as time, using their blood as cover. Uzzul saw the tactic. He approved of the cruelty and despised the distance. When the last lesser demon lunged for him, Uzzul seized it by the spine, lifted it bodily, and hurled it at the champion who had sent it. The corpse struck its master chest first, staggering it. Uzzul followed behind the impact. His blade passed through the dead servant, through the champion's guard, and into the champion's throat. Both bodies fell together. Only one skull was worth taking. The pit went mad. All around him, the bloodletter legions howled until the brass towers trembled. War engines fired into the sky. their shells bursting into rain made of teeth and flame. Chains groaned above the continent-sized wound. The ground pulsed beneath Uzzul's feet, as though the realm itself possessed a heart, and that heart had quickened. No meaningful wound marked him. Cuts smoked. Blood ran. His horn remained broken from the duel before the pit. His flesh bore shallow inscriptions written by enemy blades. None mattered. None slowed him. None had purchased even an instant of doubt. The champions of the bloodletter legions lay headless around him, their skulls added to the sack or discarded as judgment demanded. Then Khorne judged. The pressure descended with such force that the howling stopped. Every demon in the pit froze. Blood hung in the air as steam. Flames bent low. The chained things beneath the arena ceased their bellowing and whimpered into silence. Uzzul stood alone at the center of the skull pit, surrounded by corpses, carrying the 888th skull and those that had tried to deny its meaning. The blood god's will closed around him. It did not bless gently. It burned. It invaded. Warp fire erupted through Uzzul's veins, not changing what he was so much as revealing what he had always been meant to become. His spine arched. His claws dug into brass. The sack of trophies split apart, skulls tumbling across the ground around him in a clattering ring. The dead faces turned towards him as if compelled to witness. His blade screamed. The hellblade in his hand twisted, lengthening, blackening, drinking the fire that poured from him. Its edge became impossibly keen, a line of murder so pure that the air bled where it passed. Runes burned along its length, not carved, but condemned into being. It was no longer merely a weapon carried by a bloodletter. It was judgment made sharp. It was execution given form. It was the Slayer sword, and it hungered in silence. Uzzul rose. His name was taken from him and remade. The old sound belonged to the creature born beneath the brass sky, the killer who had learned worth through heads and blood. What stood now in the skull pit was something narrower, greater, more dreadful. A sacred murderer. A herald of the blood god's most personal hunger. Not a butcher of crowds, though he would walk through multitudes. Not a general in the mortal sense, though legions would answer his gesture. Not a mindless berserker, though rage was the furnace of his being. Skulltaker opened his eyes. The bloodletter legions lowered their blades. Not in peace, never in peace, in recognition. He pointed the Slayer sword toward the nearest ranks. The gesture was command enough. Those who would follow had to prove they deserved to stand within reach of his shadow. The strongest bloodletters turned instantly upon their own. The rim of the skull pit became slaughter anew. Champions hacked down rivals. Packs tore themselves apart. Horns were snapped. Bellies opened. Skulls were crushed against brass towers. Those that hesitated died first. Those that fought without purpose died next. Those that survived did so by killing with enough fury to be noticed, and enough obedience not to challenge the one who had just been judged. From that carnage, the cohort of blood was born. They gathered around him in ranks that were not clean but dreadful, red bodies slick with fresh gore, blades raised, eyes fixed upon the Slayer sword. They knew no mercy. Mercy was a word used by prey to delay the blade. They knew no retreat. Retreat was the shape cowardice wore when it had not yet been decapitated. They knew no strategy beyond slaughter, unless Skulltaker's hunt demanded a path through the meat of lesser enemies toward a worthy skull. Then they would become the blade's edge, the storm before the execution, the red tide that drowned armies so their master could reach the champion at the heart. Skulltaker turned from the skull pit. The realm opened before him. A wound split the air, ragged and blazing, its edges lined with teeth made from light and shadow. Beyond it lay real space, thin and fragile, already screaming beneath invasion. A mortal world burned under a red-black sky. Trenches stretched across continents. Hive walls cracked beneath orbital bombardment. Basilisks fired until their barrels glowed. Titans strode in the distance like walking cathedrals of wrath. 1 billion mortal soldiers were dying in mud, ash, promethium fire and panic, their prayers choking in their throats as the warp opened above them. Among them, somewhere, a champion still stood. Skulltaker stepped toward the rift. Behind him came the cohort of blood, blades rising, voices shrieking the only litany that mattered. Blood for the blood god. Skulls for the skull throne. The wound in reality swallowed them, and the massacre below became an offering. The foundries of the blood god did not sleep. Sleep was for flesh that feared the next wound. Sleep was for soldiers who rationed courage between battles. Sleep was for kings who believed walls, guards and distance could protect them from the blade already promised to their necks. In Khorne's realm, the foundries laboured without pause beneath skies of burning brass, their chimneys vomiting smoke made from soot, blood steam, and the last breaths of broken warlords. The air was furnace hot and bitter with iron. Molten metal ran in channels carved through skull-packed floors. Chains thicker than voidship anchors swung from gantries of blackened brass, hauling half-shaped beasts from pits where demon metal screamed as it cooled. Juggernauts were not made as mortal war machines were made. They were bred in rage and hammered into obedience by violence. Their bodies were iron muscle and brass hide, demon flesh and forge wrath fused into one hateful engine. Their skulls were battering rams, their legs were pillars of murder, their hooves were built to crush infantry, ceramite, ferrocrete and bone with the same contempt. They did not know fear, they knew pressure, impact, command, and the joy of trampling the living into formless red, ruin. Their eyes burned with the same mindless fury that drove avalanches, tank assaults, and the final charge of doomed armies. Around the breeding stockades, bloodletters screamed and beat their blades against the bars. Brass collars hung from hooks, each one inscribed with runes of binding. Chains were dragged by teams of lesser demons, many of them missing hands, horns or strips of flesh from earlier attempts at restraint. Heralds walked among the pens with the arrogance of killers who had survived long enough to command other killers. They carried whips made of barbed chain and blades designed not to kill quickly, but to remind the beasts that even wrath had masters beneath Khorne's gaze. In the deepest stockade, Kultiran waited. The name was already carved into the foundry walls in blood and gouged brass, not in honor, as warning. He was larger than the others, broader through the shoulders and thicker in the neck, his hide dark brass scorched almost black by forge fire. Spines of iron jutted from his flanks. His horns curved forward from a skull plated in brutal ridges of demon metal, each horn edge chipped by impacts against walls, chains, rivals and handlers. His jaws opened and closed with the grinding sound of a siege gate being torn from its hinges. Heat pulsed from him in waves. Every breath blasted sparks from his nostrils and painted the stockade bars with ember light. He had killed more of his own kind than any beast in the pens. Juggernauts were bred for violence, yet even among them, Kultiran was excess given form. He had gored rivals during feeding. He had crushed handlers beneath his hooves until their bodies became streaks in the floor channels. He had bitten through the neck of another juggernaut and shaken the body until its head came loose in a shower of molten blood. He had dragged chained demons across the stockade by the bindings they thought would hold him, smashing them against walls until their skulls burst and their limbs tore free. The foundry had tried to break him. It had failed. Once, he had driven himself headlong into the western compound wall until the brass cracked from floor to parapet. The first impact rang across the foundries like the death knell of a titan. The second split the binding runes. The third broke the wall outward in a storm of metal shards and skull mortar. Kultiran had burst through the ruin with chains dragging behind him, trampling bloodletters, knocking aside handlers, and tearing into the open yard before 6 heralds and a tide of lesser demons threw themselves upon him. 3 were pulped beneath his hooves before they even slowed him. Another lost both legs and laughed until Kultiran lowered his head and crushed the sound from him. The beast had been restrained only when hooks were driven through his flanks, chains were looped around his throat, and a brass pillar was dropped across his back by a crane of groaning demon iron. The pillar bent before he did. After that, the foundries learned to keep distance. Skulltaker came when the war drums changed. He walked through the foundry yards without escort, the Slayer sword held low in one clawed hand. The cohort of blood followed at a distance, red bodies moving through smoke and emberfall, their blades twitching with the need to kill anything that stepped too near their master. Around them, molten channels spat sparks. Hammer engines fell and rose, shaping plates of brass upon anvils made from giant skulls. Bloodletters made way, not because they were meek, but because they understood the shape of judgment when it passed among them. Kultiran felt him before he saw him. The beast turned within the ruined pen, chains creaking around his neck and forelegs. His eyes burned hotter, his nostrils flared. A growl rolled out of him, deep enough to stir the blood in the floor channels. 3 heralds stood near the gate, speaking in snarled commands to the handlers. They had come to inspect the damage, to mark the beast for punishment, perhaps to decide which bindings would be driven through his flesh next. Kultiran lowered his head. The heralds turned too late. The first died on the horns, lifted from the ground and split open from groin to throat. Black blood and ropes of inner meat poured down Kultiran's face as he shook the body free. The second struck at him with a barbed chain, the links wrapping around one horn. Kultiran surged forward, dragging the herald close, then bit down through its torso with a crunch of demon bone and armor-hard flesh. The third leapt for the beast's back, hellblade raised, shrieking a curse. Kultiran slammed himself sideways into the wall. The herald burst between brass hide and brass stone, its skull cracking like a dropped chalice, its limbs sliding down the wall in separate pieces. The stockade erupted into howls. Handlers rushed forward with hooks. Bloodletters screamed for the beast's blood. The cohort raised their blades, eager to answer violence with violence. Skulltaker lifted one hand, and his followers stilled. He watched Kultiran gore the remains of the first herald again, not because the herald still lived, but because the beast despised that the corpse had touched him. Skulltaker understood. This was not rebellion as mortals spoke of rebellion. Rebellion required grievance, pride, desire for dominion, some brittle dream of self above master. Kultiran possessed none of those things. He was violence refusing lesser hands. He was wrath that would not be guided by those too weak to survive the attempt. He had not defied command because he hated command. He had defied unworthy command. Skulltaker entered the pen. The handlers froze. Some were too slow to move away and died when Kultiran stamped forward, dragging chains behind him. The beast charged. The brass floor cracked beneath his hooves. His horns aimed for Skulltaker's chest, each point slick with herald blood and furnace soot. Skulltaker did not leap aside. He met the charge. The impact shook the stockade. Skulltaker caught one horn in each clawed hand, talons biting into demon metal. His feet gouged twin trenches backward through the brass as Kultiran drove him across the pen. Sparks flew from beneath his talons. Chains whipped around them. The beast roared into his face, a blast of heat and blood stink that would have cooked mortal lungs to black rags. Skulltaker answered by driving his brow down against the juggernaut's skull. The blow sounded like anvils cracking. Kultiran recoiled a pace. Skulltaker struck again. The beast surged, jaws snapping. One iron tooth tore across Skulltaker's shoulder, ripping open demonic flesh. Molten blood spilled down his arm and hissed upon the floor. Skulltaker seized the upper jaw before it could close and drove the hilt of the Slayer sword into the beast's snout. Kultiran reared, chains pulling taut, forehooves smashing downward. Skulltaker twisted aside enough that the first hoof missed. The second struck his thigh and would have reduced mortal armor to scrap and marrow. He remained standing, though the brass beneath him cratered. The stockade became a storm of impacts. Kultiran hammered him into walls. Skulltaker carved shallow lines across the beast's hide, never deep enough to cripple, only enough to mark pain. The juggernaut bit into his side and lifted him from the ground, shaking him like carrion. Skulltaker drove both thumbs into the beast's burning eyes until Kultiran released him with a bellow that made the foundry chains rattle. The demon champion landed on his feet, black blood streaming from his torn flank, furnace soot clinging to every wound. The beast charged again. This time Skulltaker moved under the horns, seized the collar at Kultiran's throat, and ripped it apart. The binding ring broke in a burst of runic fire. For an instant, every demon in the stockade recoiled. To free such a beast was madness. To stand before it unbound was invitation to annihilation. Kultiran did not flee. He struck harder. That was when Skulltaker knew the beast was worthy. They fought until the floor steamed beneath them. They fought until the walls were cracked and streaked with blood. They fought until dead handlers clogged the runoff channels and the air turned black with soot. Kultiran's hide was carved in a dozen places. Skulltaker's flesh hung open in ropes. Both were drenched in molten blood, their wounds glowing with inner fire. At last, Skulltaker drove the beast down by main force, planting one foot upon its neck and pressing the Slayer sword against the place where skull met spine. The blade did not fall. Kultiran heaved beneath him, still trying to rise. Skulltaker pressed harder until the floor cracked under the beast's jaw. The juggernaut's eyes burned upward, not broken, not tamed, not afraid, accepting only the truth placed upon its neck. Stronger, crueler, purposeful. Skulltaker removed the blade. Kultiran rose slowly. The cohort of blood watched in silence, a silence more violent than any cheer. Skulltaker mounted without saddle, without reins, without the meaningless ornaments mortals gave their beasts to pretend mastery. He stood astride the juggernaut's back, one clawed hand gripping an iron spine, the Slayer sword raised in the other. Kultiran roared. The foundries answered. Gates opened. Chains lifted. The war drums quickened. A battlefield waited beyond the foundry yards, a killing plain where demonic hosts clashed for the right to be called into real space. Blood crushers formed in brutal ranks, juggernauts snorting sparks beneath red riders. Skull cannons rolled forward, their wheels crushing skulls into powder. Bloodletters surged in packs, blades raised, tongues lashing over fangs as they screamed the names of slaughter. The cohort of blood gathered around Skulltaker like a red tide drawn to an executioner's edge. Then Skulltaker charged. The world became impact. Skulltaker alone was execution, a blade in the moment of judgment. A silence before a head fell. A path through armies toward the champion whose skull mattered. Mounted upon Skulltaker, he was thunder.
Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Support really helps.
The juggernaut hit the enemy line with the force of a falling fortress. Blood letters vanished beneath brass hooves, their bodies bursting into sprays of black blood and torn limbs. A demon engine lurched into their path, all hooked legs and grinding saws, and Skulltaker smashed through its forelimbs, driving it sideways into a cannon line. Skulltaker rose above the chaos, his blade taking heads as the beast carried him through the crush. The Slayer sword cut through brass plating, demon hide, chain hafts, and screaming faces with the same final contempt. Every stroke ended with a skull loosened, split, or offered. They crossed into real space through a rift that opened above a mortal war. The sky on the other side was red-black and choking. A continent burned beneath orbital debris. Human tanks rolled through ash wastes in desperate armored columns, their hulls marked with devotional script and kill tallies. Infantry crouched behind trenches of mud, wire and corpses, firing lasguns into smoke thick with screams. Armored warriors in corrupted plate charged from the opposing line, chain axes raised, while demons spilled between them like blood through a wound. Skulltaker struck the mortal armor first. A battle tank fired at near point-blank range. The shell burst against the juggernaut's shoulder in a plume of fire and shrapnel. Skulltaker did not slow. He crashed into the tank's front glacis, horns punching through plasteel, hooves climbing, weight crushing the turret ring until the machine buckled with the crew trapped inside. Men screamed within the hull. Skulltaker heard them and cared only for the officer standing in the cupola, saber raised in defiance. The Slayer sword flashed. The officer's head left his shoulders and vanished into the smoke. Another tank tried to reverse. Skulltaker ran it down. Hooves smashed through the engine deck, through armor, through bodies. Fuel ignited. Burning men spilled from hatches and were trampled into streaks of fire and meat. Armored warriors came next, loyalists in heavy plate, their helms snarling litanies through Vox grills. They fired bolters into Skulltaker's chest. Mass reactive shells burst against brass hide and demon flesh. Skulltaker rode through the detonations, searching, ignoring the lesser deaths. Skulltaker lowered his head and ploughed into them. Ceramite cracked. Bodies flew in pieces. One warrior was pinned beneath a hoof and reduced to pulp inside his own armor, the plate folding around him like a crushed reliquary. The massacre widened. Blood crushers thundered behind them. Skull cannons belched screaming skull shot into the trenches. Blood letters poured over the parapets, dragging soldiers out by their throats, opening bellies, hacking heads from shoulders and hurling the trophies into the air. The cohort of blood followed Skulltaker's path, not conquering ground, not securing flanks, not waging war as mortals understood it. They drowned the unworthy. They made a road of corpses so their master could look beyond the meat and find the skull that mattered. Skulltaker rose upon Skulltaker's back as the juggernaut crushed through another bunker, turning its firing slit into a red mouth of mashed bodies and broken guns. His gaze swept the battlefield. Officers died, priests died, tank commanders died. Champions of lesser blood howled challenges and were ignored or beheaded in passing. None were enough. None carried the weight he had been called to harvest. Then the warp trembled. Across the killing field, the sky split open with a deeper red. Not the red of burning cities, not the red of mortal blood under smoke. The red of prophecy dragged screaming into the present. A name moved through the immaterium: Armageddon. The word was already drowning in war before Skulltaker ever set eyes upon the world. It stank of ash wastes, hive spires, iron faith, endless armies and skulls beyond counting. It called to Khorne with the promise of slaughter on a scale even the brass plains could admire. There would be champions there, holy warriors, butchers, warlords, angels in grey, monsters in red, men who believed themselves unbreakable beneath the gaze of their corpse god. Cool Tyron felt the summons and stamped a crater into the battlefield. Skulltaker turned the Slayer sword toward the widening wound in the sky. The cohort screamed behind him. The blood crushers bellowed. The skull cannons thundered. Beneath them, 1 billion mortal soldiers continued to die, their war already forgotten by the executioner who had found a greater offering. Cool Tyron charged toward the rift. Together, they vanished into red fire, bound for the world whose name tasted of ash, iron, and destiny. Armageddon burned beneath a sky that had forgotten the color of mercy. From orbit, the world was a wounded sphere wrapped in smoke, fire, and industrial poison. Hive cities rose from the continents like iron mountains, their spires split open by bombardment, their manufactoria vomiting flame into ash storms that strangled entire hemispheres. Seas of dust rolled across the wastelands. Refineries detonated in chains bright enough to scar the night side of the planet. Orbital fire rained through the polluted heavens. Lance strikes and macro cannon shells falling like the judgment of dead gods. The air itself was murder, thick with promethium soot, hot metal, powdered bone, and the breath of billions dying in trenches, hab blocks, shrine yards, manufactorum tunnels, and ash-blown killing fields. Armies without number tore at one another across the corpse world. Imperial regiments held lines of ferrocrete and wire beneath banners blackened by smoke. Guardsmen fired laser guns until their barrels split, screaming catechisms through cracked lips, while commissars shot the men who broke before the demons reached them. Armored companies ground forward through mud made from ash and liquefied flesh. Basilisks thundered from behind hive walls. Lehman Russ battle tanks coughed shells into red fog, their crews deaf, bleeding and half mad from the endless concussion. Priests walked among the wounded with chainswords raised, roaring prayers to the Emperor as men with no legs tried to crawl back toward the guns. Against them came the damned. Cultists surged in tides, bare-chested beneath flak scraps and brass brands, their mouths foaming with blood as they threw themselves beneath tank tracks just to slow the machines for the warriors behind them. World Eaters in crimson and brass crashed through barricades, chain axes shrieking, their armor lacquered with gore until heraldry drowned beneath slaughter. Demons spilled through rents in reality, red bodies pouring from the immaterium in packs, claws scrabbling over stone, hellblades rising and falling in fever rhythm. The warp bled into the world in pulses. Every pulse brought more madness, more iron, more teeth, more fire. Above the slaughter, something greater moved. Angron strode through Armageddon as a god shape of rage. He was not a commander in any mortal sense. Strategy died where he walked. Plans became meat. Orders became screams. He moved through armies as an apocalypse given limbs, vast wings burning in the smoke, chain weapons roaring in hands that had broken empires. His presence bent the battlefield around him. World Eaters followed in his wake because their blood demanded it, not because Command Vox told them where to go. Tanks fired at him. Shells burst against demonic flesh and did nothing worth remembering. Infantry lines vanished beneath his charge. Bunkers opened like skulls under a boot. Armored warriors died in pieces, their transhuman bodies reduced to red fragments beneath the fury of the Red Angel. Skulltaker watched from the back of Kultiran. The Juggernaut stood upon a mound of crushed armor and dead men, snorting sparks into the burning wind. Brass hooves shifted, grinding helms, rib cages and shattered weapons deeper into the mud. Around him, the cohort of blood had already fallen upon an imperial trench line, dragging men from firing steps, hacking heads from bodies, painting the sandbags black-red until the position no longer resembled a fortification, but an opened carcass. Skulltaker did not worship Angron. Worship was not the shape of his purpose. The demon Primarch was wrath without horizon, slaughter vast enough to drown continents, a red storm beloved by the blood god. That was enough. Respect existed there, hard and cold as a blade edge. Angron was carnage incarnate. Where he walked, the blood god's work was done in ruinous abundance. But Skulltaker's gaze did not linger on the armies shattered beneath the Red Angel's passage. Mass death was the chorus. Skulls of worth were the verse. He rode through the war while the cohort surged around him. World Eaters hacked into loyalist formations beside bloodletters and flesh-branded cult hordes, all of them screaming for blood, drowning the world in close-range butchery. They crashed against gun lines, overran trenches, flooded breach points, turned armoured columns into burning tombs. The wider war consumed billions. That was the nature of Armageddon. It was not a battle. It was a planetary wound held open by hate. Skulltaker hunted the pulse within it. Commanders, champions, holy killers, names with weight, skulls that would not be lost among the heaps. Kultiran charged down an avenue between two burning hab blocks, shattering the road beneath his hooves. A line of Imperial tanks blocked the crossing ahead, hulls dug in, turrets traversing, infantry crouched between them with melter guns and missile tubes. The first tank fired. The shell struck Kultiran's chest and vanished in fire. The beast did not slow. It hit the tank head-on, horns punching through armor plate, hooves climbing over the hull. The turret buckled. Men inside screamed as brass weight crushed them into the ammunition racks. Skulltaker rose above the impact, the Slayer sword cutting down through the open commander's hatch. A head flew free, still wearing a rebreather mask and officer's cap, eyes boiled white by the heat. Not worthy. The second tank tried to reverse. Kultiran landed on its engine deck and smashed it flat. Guardsmen scattered. Bloodletters caught them before they could run far, blades flickering, heads dropping, bodies opening in wet sheets. A commissar stood his ground and fired a bolt pistol into the face of the nearest demon. The bloodletter's skull burst apart. The commissar shouted for the men to hold. Skulltaker looked at him for the span of a heartbeat, judged the defiance too small, and let the cohort tear him limb from limb. Then the air changed. The stink of demonic triumph curdled beneath a cleaner burn. Silver light cut through the ash. Wards ignited in the smoke like stars seen through corpse gas. The bloodletters nearest the avenue recoiled, hissing, their blades lifting. One of them stepped forward and dissolved from the feet upward, red flesh becoming cinders, its skull shrieking until it collapsed into ash. Grey armoured warriors emerged through the ruin. They came in disciplined formation, not rushing, not howling, not drowning themselves in fury. Their armour was silver beneath the ash, inscribed with hexagrammic wards and sanctified text. Stormbolters were locked to gauntlets. Nemesis force weapons burned with cold light. Their helms turned as one, lenses shining through the smoke. Purity seals snapped in the hot wind. Every step was measured. Every weapon was ready. The warp recoiled from them as flesh recoils from flame. At their head walked 3 brother captains. Malchior Voss bore a storm shield that shone with layered wards, its face marked by the blade scars of demon wars beyond counting. His sword was held low, point forward, as though every stride was already the beginning of a killing stroke. Orin Tain carried a long nemesis blade in both hands, psychic fire crawling along its edge, his helm crested with white and black. Severin Cord walked with damage already upon him. His breastplate was split from shoulder to sternum, one pauldron hanging loose, silver armor darkened by his own blood. Yet he carried his halberd upright and did not limp. Their vox voices carried through the smoke in controlled, severe cadence. "Ward line established," Voss said. "By Titan and by the throne, no further." "True names prepared," Tain answered. "Lesser manifestations first. Preserve focus for the Herald." Cord's voice was rougher, distorted by damage. "Brothers, lock will. Let no rage enter. Rage is the gate by which this enemy feeds." The Grey Knights opened fire. Storm bolters roared in disciplined bursts. Mass reactive shells slammed into bloodletters and burst them apart in sprays of warp ichor and cindered bone. Nemesis blades rose and fell, each strike cutting deeper than flesh, burning through the immaterial substance beneath. A pack of bloodletters reached the first rank and died within 3 breaths, hacked apart by warriors who moved like a single oath given separate bodies. One Grey Knight drove his blade through a demon's chest and spoke a banishment phrase that made the creature implode into a swirl of ash and screaming sparks. Another caught a hellblade on his warded forearm, stepped inside the blow and blew the demon's head apart with 3 precise stormbolter shots. The cohort screamed in hatred and joy. At last, prey that could kill them. They surged. The Grey Knights met them with fire, steel, and psychic contempt. Wards flared. Red bodies detonated. Hellblades scraped across sanctified armor and left smoking cuts. Bloodletters climbed over their own dead to reach the silver line, only to be cut down by force weapons that hissed through demon flesh like heated wire through fat. The clash became a furnace of hate. Silver and red locked together beneath the burning sky. Skulltaker entered the line without a roar. Kultiran crashed into the flank, crushing one Grey Knight beneath his hooves. The warrior's armor folded around him, but even as his body broke, he thrust a blade into the Juggernaut's leg and burned a black wound through demon metal. Kultiran bellowed and stamped again, reducing helm, skull and chestplate to a flattened ruin. Skulltaker dismounted into the kill zone, the Slayer sword held in one hand, his cloak of trophies rattling against his back. Voss saw him first. "Herald identified," the shield-bearing captain said. "Malchior Voss engages. Brothers, hold the breach." He came forward behind his shield. Skulltaker struck once. The Slayer sword met the warded barrier and sparks burst like burning bones. Voss did not yield. His stance absorbed the impact. His own sword cut in answer, fast and controlled, forcing Skulltaker to turn the blow aside. The Grey Knight fought as a wall fights, not with rage, not with flourish, with refusal. The shield met every killing angle. Its wards screamed beneath the Slayer sword, but they endured. Skulltaker struck again and again, testing. High, low, back edge, horn feint, step cut. Voss adjusted each time, boots grinding trenches in the ash, his sword stabbing out whenever the demon came too close. "Abomination," Voss said through clenched vox. "By the sigils of banishment, I name thee unclean." The words struck like cold hooks. Skulltaker felt them bite at his form. He answered by stepping into the next shield bash rather than away from it. The impact cracked one of his ribs. It also placed him close enough to seize the rim of the shield with his free hand. Voss drove his sword toward the demon's throat. Skulltaker twisted, took the wound across the shoulder, and wrenched the shield aside. The Slayer sword came down. It cut through the shield's edge, through the forearm behind it, through the gorget seal, and into the neck. Voss remained standing for a moment, head half severed, Stormbolter still firing into Skulltaker's torso at point-blank range. Then the demon finished the cut. The captain's skull came free in its helm, trailing blood and burned ward light. Orin Tain was already moving. His blade came in a line of silver fire that forced Skulltaker back a step. The psychic swordsman did not fight like Voss. He flowed. His strikes changed before they arrived, guided by foresight and will. Each movement carried banishment within it. Each cut sought not simply to wound the demon's body, but to unmake the idea that held him in real space. "Your name is known," Tain said. "Your nature is measured. Your end is written." Skulltaker answered with the Slayer sword. Their blades met, and the air screamed. Tain pressed harder, his psychic might blazing. Blood letters too near the duel burst into ash from the force of his presence. The Grey Knight's sword cut Skulltaker across the chest, and for the first time on Armageddon, the Herald's flesh smoked with a wound that mattered. Tain stepped into the opening, chanting words that made the ash rise from the ground in spirals. Skulltaker inclined his head. Worthy. The next exchange was too swift for mortal eyes. Silver flame and red murder crossed, parted, crossed again. Tain's blade sliced one horn. Skulltaker's sword opened the captain's thigh. Tain turned the injury into a pivot and drove a psychic thrust towards Skulltaker's heart. The demon caught the blade in his left hand. Warded silver burned through his palm. He held it there anyway. Tain tried to pull free. Skulltaker dragged him close and head-butted him hard enough to crack the faceplate of his helm. The chant faltered. The Slayer sword rose between them and punched through the damaged visor. The blade emerged from the back of Tain's helm, wreathed in fading silver fire. Skulltaker withdrew it, and the Grey Knight collapsed without another word. Severin Cord came last. The wounded captain had been holding the line while his brothers died. Around him, broken demons lay in heaps. His armor was ruined now, split wider, one arm hanging with severed cabling and blood running freely from beneath the plates. Still, he stepped forward. His halberd rested in both hands. His helm was gone. His face was pale beneath ash and blood, eyes hard, jaw set, scalp marked with old service studs. He looked at the skulls in Skulltaker's grasp. "Malchior," he said. "Orin." His voice held no plea. Skulltaker waited. Cord lifted his halberd in salute. "I am Severin Cord of the Grey Knights. I deny you passage. I deny you triumph. I deny your master." The wounded captain charged. There was no perfection in him now, no untouched discipline, no elegant shieldcraft or psychic grace. There was only refusal. He fought with a split chestplate and blood in his throat, driving the halberd in brutal arcs, each blow powered by transhuman strength and sacred hatred. Skulltaker cut him once across the ribs. Cord kept coming. The Slayer sword opened his leg. Cord slammed the haft into Skulltaker's jaw. Kultiran bellowed nearby, crushing another silver warrior beneath its hooves. But Skulltaker did not look away from the captain before him. Cord's halberd pierced Skulltaker's side. The wound burned cold. The captain twisted the blade and spat blood onto the ash. "Return to the warp," he growled. Skulltaker seized the halberd shaft and snapped it. Khorne drew a combat blade from his belt and stepped in close, stabbing for the throat. Skulltaker caught his wrist, broke it, and drove the Grey Knight to his knees. Khorne did not kneel. His legs failed beneath damage and blood loss. His will did not. He tried to rise even as Skulltaker placed one clawed hand upon his bare head. The 8 words of sacrifice were not spoken for him, not all of them. The moment was too violent, too immediate, too rich with the taste of defiance. Skulltaker gave him a fragment of the right, enough for the skull to know it had been chosen. Khorne spat blood into the demon's face. Skulltaker tore his head from his shoulders. The silver line broke around them. Not from cowardice. Grey Knights did not break as mortal men broke. They died in place, one by one, taking bloodletters with them, burning holes in the cohort, turning the avenue into a charnel shrine of red ash and silver corpses. But the captains were dead. The command pulse was severed. The demonic tide closed around what remained. Skulltaker stood amid the ruin with 3 Grey Knight skulls held aloft, 2 still locked within their helms, one bare and bloody, its eyes open to the burning sky. Around him, the cohort howled until the hab blocks shook. Kultyrans stamped and crushed the bodies beneath him. World Eaters roared from the wider battle, chain axes raised toward the smoke. Far across the war zone, Angron's howl rolled over Armageddon like the voice of a world being butchered. The Imperium's holiest warriors had come with wards, oaths, true names and blades made to unmake demons. They had died as all champions died when the blood god's executioner found them. Skulltaker lowered the skulls and turned toward the next firestorm, where more commanders still lived, where more heroes still believed their names could matter. Armageddon burned on, and the skull tithe was not yet complete. Agrippina 6 was not a world so much as a wound packed with iron teeth. The Orks had remade the war zone in their own image. Continents that had once held plains, refinery belts, fortress lines and manufacturing grids were buried beneath scrap fortresses, gun towers, chained engines and crude idols hammered from the wreckage of conquered armies. Smoke belched from every horizon. Engines howled without rhythm. Tracked fortresses crawled over fields of broken tanks. Gargant shadows moved through curtains of ash, their guns booming like gods with crude laughter in their throats. Banners snapped from poles made of welded Lascanon barrels and snapped tank masts, each glyph daubed in blood, oil and yellow paint. The ground was layered in corpses. Human defenders lay in heaps around collapsed bunkers, their uniforms black with soot, their helmets split, their hands still clenched around empty rifles. Orcs lay among them in greater heaps, not as the dead of a beaten army, but as the shed skin of a horde too vast to care how many bodies it spent. Grots scurried through the piles, stealing teeth, ammunition, fingers, boots, and anything shiny enough to survive the mud. Burner fumes rolled across trenches filled with cooked meat. Shells screamed overhead. Artillery walked across the landscape in constant stuttering impacts, turning armour, flesh and scrap into red earth. The Orc horde had made the theatre into a single continent-sized scrap fort. Every ridge bore guns. Every ravine hid engines. Every bridge was a jaw of rusted metal. Battle wagons thundered through avenues of wrecked Imperial armour, their crews hanging from chains and laughing as they fired in every direction. Defcopters buzzed above like insane metal insects, trailing smoke, wobbling under the weight of rockets, pilots bellowing challenges at targets they had not yet chosen. Stompers stomped through ruined city blocks, their belly guns flashing, their iron feet crushing hab towers into dust. The whole world seemed to shout, clank, burn and bleed. At its heart stood war boss Grim Snag Urk. He was massive even for his kind, a tower of green muscle, scar tissue, iron plates and violent certainty. His lower jaw had been rebuilt with black steel after some forgotten rival had failed to kill him properly. One tusk was capped in brass. The other had been broken and sharpened into a jagged spike. His left arm ended in a power claw large enough to tear open a tank turret. His right carried a chopper made from the blade of an Imperial dozer plough, its edge reworked by mech boys until it could hack through armor and still be crude enough to please him. Spent shell casings, enemy helmets, and the skulls of rival bosses hung from chains across his chest. He ruled because he was bigger. He ruled because he was louder. He ruled because every orc who had tried to take his place had ended up as meat, trophy, or lesson. Around him gathered his armoured knob bodyguard, a wall of brutal green-skin nobility encased in plates looted from tanks, dreadnoughts, battlesuits, and dead space marines. They carried combi weapons, buzzsaws, chain choppers, power claws, spiked shields, and guns that looked as if they had been built by angry children with access to industrial wreckage and no fear of death. Their armour smoked from fresh impacts. Their faces were split by tusked grins. They shoved one another, laughed, fired at distant targets for amusement, and waited for the next thing worth killing. Grim Snag stood atop a mound of wrecked tanks and watched the red tear open in reality. Demons poured from it. Bloodletters came first, shrieking, leaping, stabbing, cutting into orc mobs that surged forward in delight. Behind them came blood crushers, brass beasts trampling through scrap barricades, riders swinging blades that smoked with warp heat. Skull cannons rolled out of the wound, belching flame, and skull shot into the horde. Khornate warbands followed, crimson armoured lunatics with chain axes raised, their vox grills vomiting praise to the blood god. Above the roar of guns and the bellow of orcs, the warp itself snarled. Grim Snag laughed. It began deep in his chest and shook, flakes of dried blood from his armour. He leaned forward, eyes burning with savage amusement. "Now dat," he said, his voice blasting through the loudhailers bolted to the scrap towers around him, "is a proper fight." The knobs roared approval. One of them, a broad brute with a cannon for an arm and half a tank hatch bolted over his face, pointed toward the largest red shape advancing through the carnage. "Boss, dat one's got a fancy sword. Looks dead killy." Grim Snag's grin widened. Across the killing field, Skulltaker rode Kultiran through the war. The juggernaut smashed through orc lines with thunderous contempt, brass hooves crushing greenskins into red-green paste. Shooters hammered into him. Rockets burst against his hide. A truck sped toward him, horn blaring, crew laughing, ramplate lowered. Kultiran met it head-on. The truck folded around his horns. Orcs flew from the wreck, limbs spinning, bodies bursting against the ground. Skulltaker rose upon the beast's back, the Slayer sword moving in measured arcs, every stroke taking a head from a creature large enough to draw his passing notice. But most were not enough. Orcs fought without despair. That made them pleasing. They died laughing, cursing, spitting teeth, reaching for blades, trying to bite through demon flesh, even as their own bodies emptied. Yet worth was not merely ferocity. Worth was command proven through personal violence. Worth was the skull that held a horde together. Worth was the warlord whose name made millions of brutal creatures surge harder toward death. Skulltaker saw Grim Snag Urk atop the mound of wreckage. The orc warboss saw him in return. Their gazes met across artillery smoke. burning scrap and the slaughter of armies. Grim Snag lifted his power claw and snapped it open and shut. Lightning crackled between the blades. "Oh aye, Red Skull Face," he bellowed. "You look like the best scrap I've had in years. Come get crumped." Skulltaker did not answer. He turned Kultiran toward the mound. The knobs charged to meet him. They came roaring down the slopes of wrecked armor, firing as they ran. Shells hit bloodletters and blew them apart. Rockets streaked into the cohort and burst among red bodies, scattering limbs and shrieking skulls. A knob in mega armor crashed into Kultiran, with enough force to halt lesser mounts. The juggernaut lowered his head and drove both horns through the orc's chestplate. The knob whooped blood into his own visor and tried to bring a buzzsaw down on the beast's neck. Skulltaker's blade passed through the knob's wrist, then through the throat seal, then through the armored neck beneath. The head bounced away inside its iron helm. Another knob leapt from the wreckage above, twin chain choppers howling. Skulltaker dismounted as the orc fell toward him, stepping aside from the impact and opening the creature from armpit to hip. The knob hit the ground in halves, still trying to laugh through a mouth full of black blood. A third swung a power claw at Skulltaker's head. The demon ducked beneath the blow, cut behind the knee, then removed the orc's other leg as it toppled. The knob hit the mudface first and began dragging itself forward by its fists. "Get back here, you skinny red git," it snarled. Skulltaker took the head without slowing. The bodyguard closed around him, a mob of armored brutality. They did not defend Grim Snag with discipline. They defended him by trying to reach the best fight first. That made them dangerous in their own crude way. A knob smashed Skulltaker from behind with a spiked shield, driving him into the mud. Another fired a combi scorcher at point-blank range, bathing the demon in greasy flame. A third drove a chain blade into Skulltaker's side and leaned on it, roaring with delight as demonic blood sprayed across his face. Skulltaker rose through them. He broke the shield-bearer's arm and took his jaw with the pommel of the Slayer sword. He pushed through the flame and severed the burner wielder's head at the tusks. He let the chain blade chew deeper into his side until the knob overbalanced, then seized the orc by the throat and carved through the spine from the front. Heads fell into the mud. Armor plates split. Green bodies convulsed around fountains of blood and severed nerves. Kultiran fought beside him, or perhaps the word beside was too gentle for what the beast did. He hurled himself into the knobs, like a living battering ram, crushing them beneath brass hooves, tearing them open with his horns, smashing one into a scrap wall until the orc burst through it in pieces. A power claw clamped around one of the juggernaut's horns. Kultiran ripped backward, tore the arm from its socket, and trampled the howling owner into the mud. When the last of the bodyguard fell, Grim Snag descended. The warboss did not look angered by the slaughter of his knobs. He looked delighted. "Ha!" he barked. "They was getting too big in the gob anyway." He rolled his shoulders. The power claw screamed as its field intensified. Around him, orcs gathered in widening rings, shoving for a view, fighting among themselves for better footing. No despair touched them. Their boss had lost his guard. That only meant the real fight had started. Grim Snag charged. His speed was obscene for something so huge. The power claw came in low, tearing a trench through mud and metal. Skulltaker stepped aside and cut across the warboss's flank. The blade bit deep, but Grim Snag's hide and armor were thick with scars, plates, and stubborn life. The orc turned with the wound and brought his chopper down. Skulltaker lifted the Slayer sword to meet it. The impact cracked the ground beneath them. Grim Snag headbutted him. The blow smashed Skulltaker backward into the side of a burned-out tank. The tank's hull buckled around him. Orcs roared with laughter. Grim Snag advanced, blood pouring from his flank, grin wider than before. "Dat all, demon," he growled. "I've had grots bite harder." Skulltaker pulled himself from the dented metal. He inclined his head. Worthy. The duel became the center of the war. Around them, Agrippina VI continued to butcher itself. Billions fought and died across the wider theatre. Orc mobs crashed into demon packs beneath storming artillery. Human defenders trapped between both horrors fired into whatever came closest, their lines swallowed by green charges and red tides alike. War engines dueled under falling orbital wreckage. A burning cruiser fragment tore through the cloud cover and fell like a mountain made of fire, striking the horizon with a flash that turned armies into silhouettes and then into ash. Stompus fought brass demonic engines in the ruins of Manufactoria, ripping plates free, belching shells, collapsing through buildings as thousands died beneath them without being noticed. Through the whole span of daylight, Skulltaker and Grim Snag fought. Grim Snag landed blows. His power claw caught Skulltaker across the chest and hurled him through a pile of scrap guns. The field around the claw tore strips from demonic flesh and cracked the iron trophy hooks at his waist. The chopper came down and split the brass ground where Skulltaker had stood a breath before. When Skulltaker closed in, Grim Snag kicked him with a boot the size of a bunker door and sent him skidding through blood mud and teeth. The war boss laughed at every wound he suffered and grew louder with each one he inflicted. "That's it," Grim Snag roared as he tore a chunk from a fallen war engine with his claw and hurled it. "Keep coming. I ain't finished enjoying meself." The slab struck Kultiran and drove the juggernaut aside in a spray of sparks. The war engine behind them, already burning and half collapsed, gave a metallic groan. Its leg assemblies buckled. A tower of guns and armor plates began to fall toward the duel. Skulltaker moved. Grim Snag did not. The collapsing machine crashed down between them and around them, a storm of iron plates, ruptured ammunition and burning fuel. The ground vanished beneath the impact. Orcs cheered as fire swallowed everything. Bloodletters died under falling metal. Grots ran screaming with their backs aflame. When the smoke parted, Grim Snag emerged first, pushing a plate of wreckage off his shoulders, one side of his face scorched black. "Missed me," he said to the ruin. Skulltaker came from the smoke behind him and cut the tendon behind the war boss's knee. Grim Snag staggered. The orcs booed and laughed in the same breath. The duel changed then. Skulltaker stopped meeting the war boss's strength and began dismantling it. Patience became the blade. He carved the same wounded leg again, then again, never staying long enough for the power claw to close. He cut the wrist beneath the chopper hand. He opened the elbow joint. He sliced deep into the cables and muscle controlling the power claw arm. Grim Snag roared, turning, hacking, kicking, smashing. Every attack was strong enough to kill. Every miss cost him blood. Every hit Skulltaker allowed was purchased for a deeper wound in return. Night fell beneath a sky lit by burning wreckage. The duel did not end. By moonless dark and artillery flash, Grim Snag fought on. His breathing became a wet engine rasp. His left leg dragged. His right arm hung half useless, chopper still clutched in fingers that would not open. The power claw sparked and stuttered, one blade snapped, its field flickering. He had lost blood enough to drown a squad of men, but orcs were made for war in ways even their enemies struggled to hate properly. He still laughed. He still cursed. He still tried to close his teeth around Skulltaker's throat when the demon came too near. Skulltaker ruined the second leg at dawn. The cut took Grim Snag behind the knee and dropped him to one side. The war boss caught himself with the power claw, shattering the ground beneath it. He swung the chopper in a final broad arc. Skulltaker stepped inside and cut the arm away at the shoulder. The chopper fell. The orc horde went quiet for the first time. Grim Snag knelt in the mud, one leg dead beneath him, one arm gone, the other sparking and crippled. Blood poured from him in steaming sheets. His metal jaw clicked as he tried to grin. "Good scrap," he said. Skulltaker stood before him. The 8 words of sacrifice formed in the air without kindness. Orcs did not understand such rites as men or Eldar might. Grim Snag did not need to understand. His skull understood. His worth had been carved into the battlefield through day, night, blood, and refusal. He had bowed to nothing. He had laughed at the executioner. He had given wounds that lesser champions would have called victory. Grim Snag spat a gobbet of blood and broken teeth at Skulltaker's feet. "Do it den," the war boss growled, "and make it loud." The Slayer sword rose. It fell. Grim Snag Urk's head came free in a spray of dark blood. The metal jaw still locked in a grin, the eyes still bright with the last echo of battle joy. His huge body sagged forward and struck the mud like a felled bunker. Skulltaker caught the skull by the iron jaw before it touched the ground. For a long moment, Agrippina 6 seemed to hold its breath. Then the orcs erupted, not in grief, not in fear, in hunger. They roared, fought, shoved, laughed, fired guns into the air and at each other. Some bellowed Grim Snag's name. Others shouted that they had always known the boss would die one day. Many pointed at Skulltaker and screamed challenges over the gunfire. "Me next." "Nah, me next, you runt. I'm gonna nick dat shiny sword. Dat red git's mine." Skulltaker mounted Grim Snag's skull into the tally of worthy trophies, fastening it among the chosen dead with wire, sinew, and demon craft. The huge orc head hung heavy, tusks jutting, metal jaw glinting in the firelight. Around him, the battlefield surged again as the orc horde hurled itself toward the monster that had slain their war boss, each greenskin desperate not to avenge him in any noble sense, but to earn the next best fight. Kultiran stamped beside Skulltaker, crushing a charging orc into paste before the creature had taken 3 steps. Skulltaker looked across the roaring green tide. Most skulls had no meaning. But the killing would continue until another proved otherwise. Haran Shamash had been beautiful before the war found it. Beauty lingered still, but only as a dying nerve remembers touch after the limb is gone. Wraithbone towers rose from the valley like pale spears of frozen song, their curves too elegant for human stonecraft, their surfaces veined with psychic light that pulsed weakly beneath soot and blood. Bridges arched between shattered spires without support, some broken halfway across and hanging over the battlefield like snapped ribs. Spirit shrines burned in colours no mortal flame could make, blue and white and violet fire licking across rune-carved walls, while the souls within screamed soundlessly through the infinity circuit. The screams were everywhere. They did not fill the air as mortal cries did. They moved beneath it. They trembled inside the wraithbone, shivered along cracked paths, bled from broken spirit stones, and echoed through every elegant chamber that had become a killing ground. Grav tanks lay overturned in the courtyards, their sleek hulls split open, pilots hanging from their cockpits in ribbons of torn armor and translucent blood. Shuriken catapults lay abandoned beside severed hands still locked around their grips. Aspect banners smouldered in the hot wind. The dead of Haran Shamash wore war masks, and even in death their helms seemed to stare with accusation rather than fear. The Aeldari had not fled. They had arranged their doom with precision. Skulltaker crossed the outer gardens through drifts of ash that had once been spirit leaves. Behind him came the cohort of blood, a red tide of hellblades and fanged hunger, their shrieks scraping against the psychic architecture until the wraithbone answered with cracks of pain. Kultiran prowled at his side, each brass hoof punching craters into pathways shaped by minds that had understood grace before mankind had crawled from its first cradle of mud. The juggernaut snorted sparks at the alien dead, unimpressed by elegance, unmoved by sorrow. The first killing zone opened with silence. No crude roar announced it. No gun line flashed too early. The Eldari struck as a blade revealed only when it entered flesh. Disciplined shuriken fire filled the air. It came from terraces above, from fractured balconies and the shadows between shrine pillars. Monomolecular discs hissed through the smoke in a storm so dense that bloodletters came apart mid-stride. Red limbs spun away. Horned heads split down the center. Demonic bodies became shredded meat, their ichor spraying across white wraithbone in black steaming arcs. The cohort hurled itself upward, shrieking praise and hatred, but the fire adjusted with cold perfection, cutting into the mass, stripping bodies from skulls, turning the foremost ranks into a twitching carpet of demon flesh. Upon the highest terrace stood the first exarch. His armor was blue and white, crested and immaculate despite the ruin around him. A dire Avenger Shrine Lord, his helm marked by long service, his twin catapults raised with ritual poise. Around him, his aspect warriors shifted firing patterns without a word, every volley guided by the discipline of a warrior path walked too long to ever leave. "You are seen, executioner," the exarch said. His voice carried through helm speakers with cold clarity. "You are not battle. You are appetite given a blade." Skulltaker looked up. The dire Avenger fired directly into him. Shuriken discs struck his chest, his throat, his face, slicing demonic flesh into smoking cuts. Skulltaker walked through the blade storm. Kultiran lunged toward the terrace, but Skulltaker raised one clawed hand. The beast halted, growling. The skull was his. He climbed the broken wall as the exarch poured fire into him. Bloodletters died around him, shredded by the Avenger line, but Skulltaker did not turn aside. He reached the terrace, the Slayer sword rising. The exarch crossed both catapults and fired point blank into the daemon's face. Flesh peeled. One horn was scored black. Skulltaker's blade cut once. The catapults fell in halves. The second cut took the exarch's head, helm and spirit stone together, cleanly from the shoulders. The remaining Avengers fired until the cohort reached them. Then the terrace became red. The second killing zone was beneath the terrace, where shadow gathered too thickly. A striking scorpion exarch emerged from concealment behind Skulltaker, green armor blackened with ash, chainsword already howling. Mandiblasters flashed, white heat stitched across Skulltaker's back. The scorpion chainsword bit into his side and tore a trench through demonic muscle. The exarch moved with predatory skill, vanishing behind pillars, striking from angles no mortal warrior could read. "You mistake endurance for destiny," the scorpion said from the smoke. Skulltaker stood motionless. The exarch came from above, blade angled for the spine. Skulltaker turned before he landed. One claw caught the chainsword wrist. The Slayer sword pierced the exarch through the chest and pinned him to the pillar behind him. For a breath, the Eldari warrior hung there, boots above the ground, spirit stone blazing red in the instant before rupture. "You were heard," the exarch whispered. Skulltaker tore the blade sideways and took the head as the body fell. Fusion fire answered. The third exarch came from the shrine of the fire dragons, armor the color of flame and molten scale. He strode through a gateway wreathed in heat haze, his fusion gun held with both hands, his helm shaped in the image of a drake's wrath. Around him, fire dragons emerged in a disciplined line. Their weapons lit the courtyard with miniature suns. The first blast struck Skulltaker. The juggernaut roared as demon brass ran molten down his shoulder. The second blast vaporized a cluster of bloodletters, leaving only smoking talons and the stink of cooked warp flesh. The third hit Skulltaker square in the chest. For an instant, he vanished in white heat. The fire dragon exarch lowered his weapon a fraction. "He is not ended," said another warrior. "No," said the exarch. "He is coming." Skulltaker emerged from the glare of flame. Demonic flesh burned from his ribs. The Slayer sword glowed red-white along its edge. The fire dragons fired again, but he was already among them. The first lost both arms and his head in the same motion. The second was split from shoulder to opposite hip. The exarch reversed his fusion gun, using it as a staff to deflect a strike that would have killed him instantly. The weapon melted where the Slayer sword touched it. The exarch drew a blade from his back and struck for Skulltaker's throat. It was a worthy gesture. It failed. Skulltaker took the sword hand, then the head, leaving the spirit stone to crack upon the burning floor. The fourth, fifth, and sixth exarchs drew him through the hall of falling stars. Dark reapers stood along the upper ledges, their black armor still as grave markers, missile launchers tracking with funereal patience. Their exarch fired first, a shrieking projectile that struck Skulltaker's shoulder and detonated hard enough to fling him through a wraithbone arch. The second missile hit where he rose. The third would have taken his head had he not seized a dying bloodletter and raised it into the path. The lesser demon burst apart. Skulltaker crossed the hall beneath a rain of explosive death, climbed the ledge through impacts that cracked bone and brass alike, and cut the Dark Reaper exarch in half at the waist before taking the skull from the falling upper body. A swooping hawk exarch descended next from the fractured dome, wings blazing, lasblaster fire stitching across Skulltaker's path. He dropped grenades that burst in sunbursts of monofilament and light, shredding bloodletters below. His voice came clear and sorrowful through the din. "Monster of the Red God, I have seen the path. I know the cost." Skulltaker hurled the freshly severed Reaper skull upward. The hawk twisted aside. Not enough. The skull struck one wing assembly, breaking the line of descent. Skulltaker leapt from the ledge, seized the exarch in mid-fall, and drove them both through the cracked dome floor. They landed among broken crystal. The hawk tried to rise. Skulltaker stamped on one wing, tore it free in a spray of blood and psychoactive circuitry, then removed the head. The warp spider exarch was waiting where reality thinned. He flickered in and out of existence, his death spinner vomiting clouds of monofilament that sliced bloodletters into red mist. He struck, vanished, struck again, never remaining where the Slayer sword fell. His laughter was not mirthful. It was bitter, old, trapped within armor and path. "You chase what is not there, butcher." Skulltaker watched the pattern. He allowed the monofilament to cut his arm to the bone. He allowed another burst to open his thigh. The exarch appeared behind him for the killing shot. Skulltaker drove his blade backward without turning. The Slayer sword entered the moment of arrival, cutting not only flesh, but the warp echo that carried it. The spider exarch spasmed into full existence with the blade through his body. Skulltaker turned, grasped the helm, and took the skull before the body finished dying. The killing zones tightened. The 7th exarch rode a jet bike through a colonnade of bone-white pillars, lance leveled, shining spear armor flashing like a shard of dead lightning. He struck Skulltaker head-on, the laser lance punching a burning hole into the juggernaut's flank. Skulltaker bellowed and twisted. Skulltaker caught the second pass by the lance shaft, was dragged through 3 pillars, then planted his feet and wrenched the rider from the saddle. The exarch struck the ground rolling, blade drawn before he stopped. Skulltaker gave him 3 exchanges, before cutting the legs from under him and taking the head. The 8th and 9th came together despite the plan. 2 Shrine Lords, one of the Avengers and one of the Scorpions, trying to weave discipline and ambush into a single pattern. They nearly succeeded. The Avenger forced Skulltaker's guard high with a storm of shuriken. The Scorpion came low from beneath a fallen grav tank, Chainsword chewing into the demon's knee. Skulltaker crushed the Scorpion's helm beneath his foot before the warrior could withdraw, then threw the body into the Avenger's line of fire. The momentary hesitation cost the blue-armored exarch his skull. The 10th came with fire, the 11th with missiles, the 12th with a blade that had drunk demon blood before. Each died faster than the last, not because they lacked skill, but because Skulltaker learned them as they revealed themselves. He ignored guardians who fired into him from behind cover. He ignored wounded aspect warriors crawling toward fallen weapons. He ignored lesser souls unless they barred his path. The cohort of blood gave them no such mercy. Bloodletters flooded the lower shrine, hacking through elegant warriors, tearing soul stones from breastplates, biting into throats, smearing sacred floors with ruin. The 13th exarch wounded Skulltaker's pride first. He was a Crimson Hunter Shrine Lord forced to fight on foot after his aircraft had been brought down in the opening storm. His flight armor was cracked, one side of his helm broken away, revealing an angular face pale with psychic strain and contempt. He stood amid the wreck of his fighter and raised a long dueling blade. "You come for skulls," he said, "yet you cannot understand what a soul is." Skulltaker advanced. The Hunter Exarch did not retreat. He fought with the precision of one born to aerial war, translating impossible turns into footwork, every cut arriving from a line that seemed wrong until it struck. He opened Skulltaker's cheek. He cut one of the trophy cords and sent 3 lesser skulls clattering across the floor. Skulltaker's answer was immediate and terrible. He seized the Exarch by the broken helm, smashed his face into the wreck of his own aircraft, and took the skull from the ruin with his bare hands. The 14th died buying seconds. The 15th died closing a gate. The 16th died in silence, a dark reaper who fired his last missile into the ceiling and brought half the shrine down upon himself and the cohort. When the dust cleared, Skulltaker rose from beneath Wraithbone's slabs with the Exarch's head in his fist, its helm crushed but recognizable, its spirit stone dark. Then only Kael'thir remained. He waited in the Crimson Shrine at the heart of Haran Shamash, where every wall was carved with the names of warriors who had surrendered themselves to the path until nothing else remained. Red spirit lamps burned along the floor. The infinity circuit screamed beneath them, louder here, more intimate, as though the dead leaned close to witness the last exchange. Kael'thir's armor was crimson and ivory, neither ostentatious nor plain. His helm was held beneath one arm. His face was calm, severe, ancient in the way exarchs became ancient, not through years alone, but through the accumulation of war masks and dead selves. A long blade rested in his right hand. Around him lay no ambush, no hidden squad, no layered fire lane. Skulltaker entered alone. Kultiran remained beyond the threshold, held there by a gesture. The cohort raged outside the shrine, but none crossed after him. Kelthir looked upon the demon and spoke softly. I have walked every strand permitted to me. In each, I die. Skulltaker said nothing. In some, I wound you. In some, I save those already dead. In some, I deny you the shape of victory you desire. The exarch raised his blade. I choose the path that leaves you unsatisfied. He attacked. Kelthir was not the strongest. He was not the swiftest. He was not the most destructive. He was the most exact. Every movement denied spectacle. Every parry refused rhythm. He gave Skulltaker no grand wound, no roaring charge, no moment of obvious worth for the blood god's delight. He fought to reduce the ritual, to make the execution ugly, narrow, delayed. His blade cut trophy cords, severed bindings, struck at the cloak rather than the flesh. Skulls fell from Skulltaker's mantle and rolled across the shrine floor, their whispers rising in agitation. Skulltaker's silence changed. The demon pressed harder. Kelthir retreated by inches, always cutting, always denying. He scored the Slayer sword's grip. He sliced into Skulltaker's hand and made him bleed upon his own weapon. He drove his blade through one of the gathered skulls at Skulltaker's waist, shattering a lesser trophy into powder. That was the wound he had chosen. Not flesh, pride. Skulltaker struck with sudden finality. The Slayer sword broke Kelthir's blade at the midpoint, sheared through the exarch's breastplate, and opened him from shoulder to sternum. Kelthir staggered, but did not fall. He looked down at the ruin of his body, then back up at the demon. Not all skulls praise you, he whispered. Skulltaker seized him by the throat and spoke the rite. The 8 words of sacrifice burned through the crimson shrine. Spirit lamps burst. The infinity circuit shrieked. Kelthir's eyes hardened, and for a heartbeat, his dead predecessors seemed to stare through him in shared contempt. Then the Slayer sword moved, and the 17th exarch's head came free. Silence followed. Not peace. The shrine would never know peace again. Outside, the cohort still killed. Bloodletters still laughed and shrieked through Wraithbone halls. Kultiran still stamped and snorted at the threshold. Yet at the heart of Haran Shamash, where 17 shrine champions had arranged their deaths with all the cold brilliance of their dying race, the sound fell away. Skulltaker lifted Kelthir's skull. The ruined shrine did not matter. The world did not matter. Victory, conquest, territory, banners, all the little concerns of generals and kings meant nothing beneath the gaze of Khorne. 17 worthy skulls had been taken. In the Wraithbone halls of Haran Shamash, demonic laughter echoed like blades drawn across bone. Skulltaker returned to the brass citadel with the dead dragging behind him. The sacks were swollen near rupture, stitched from flayed demon hide and bound with cords of sinew, each one heavy with skulls taken from battlefields that still burned in the memory of real space. Armageddon gave him silver helms and sanctified bone, skulls that had once held oaths to Titan, wards against the warp, and the cold discipline of warriors bred to face damnation without trembling. Agrippina VI gave him tusks, iron jaws, crude metal plates, and the huge grinning head of Grim Snag, still seeming to laugh even in death. Haran Shamash gave him elegant Aeldari skulls, each one light in the hand, each one resonant with the fading grief of a warrior path, walked too far to ever be abandoned. There were others, countless others, the skulls of mortal kings who had ruled hive clusters from thrones of polished bone, the skulls of mutant prophets whose tongues had spoken lies in the name of slaughter, the skulls of Xenos blade masters, pirate lords, beast tyrants, renegade captains, oath-sworn duelists and warlords who had believed their names would endure. Some had cursed him as they died, some had prayed, some had laughed, some had understood. All had been taken, all had become weight. The realm welcomed him with war. The brass plains shook beneath the march of demonic armies. Bloodletters howled from ridges of skulls, hacking at one another in celebration of his return. Juggernauts thundered beside rivers of blood, their hooves striking sparks from the metal earth. Skull cannons rolled in processions of iron and bone, their barrels belching smoke that formed the faces of the newly damned. Far away, bloodthirsters wheeled beneath the burning sky, their wings blotting out butchered suns, their roars falling like avalanches over the endless battlefield. Ahead rose the brass citadel. No mortal fortress could be compared to it without insulting the scale of horror. It did not stand upon the land. It dominated the realm as a wound dominates flesh. Its ramparts rose beyond sight, black brass walls hammered by wars older than species, each surface impaled with skulls in numbers that murdered reason. Gates of molten brass opened and closed like the jaws of a god beast, each movement releasing floods of heat, smoke, and screams. Rivers of blood poured from beneath those gates in cataracts wide enough to drown armies, flowing down channels carved through mountains of bone before joining the red torrents below. Towers of bone climbed the citadel walls, stacked from the remains of champions, tyrants, and saints, mortared with gore and bound in iron. Chains hung from the battlements, their links made of fused skulls, each one whispering its last moment again and again into the furnace air. War engines prowled along the parapets. Daemon hosts gathered beneath the towers in multitudes too vast for counting, red ranks and brass beasts and winged nightmares, all drawn into silence as Skulltaker approached. Silence did not belong in Khorne's realm. That made it heavier. The cohort of blood followed him through the blood channels and between the skull mounds, their blades lowered but ready. They were drenched in the gore of real space and the ash of burned shrines. They had butchered men in trenches, orcs in scrap fortresses, Eldari in wraithbone halls, and demons who had dared stand between their master and his offerings. They did not chant now. Their throats quivered with withheld violence. Their eyes burned upon the gates. Kultiran walked beside Skulltaker, blackened brass hides scarred by fusion fire, bolter impacts, power claw gouges, and the marks of battles that would have shattered lesser beasts. The Juggernaut's breath came in furnace blasts. His hooves crushed skulls into powder with every step. Demons gave him space, though hatred burned in their eyes, for no beast was meant to pass freely where only the chosen and the terrible were permitted. Yet Kultiran had earned passage by destruction. The brass citadel did not forgive weakness. It admitted only violence that had proven itself. The gates opened. Heat rolled outward. Skulltaker entered. Within, the citadel was a madness of vast halls, smoke-choked passages, rivers of blood flowing through channels in the floors, and vaults where skulls were sorted by worth beneath the gaze of things chained to pillars of brass. The walls sweated gore. The ceiling vanished into smoke and shadow, lit by the red glow of furnaces where weapons screamed as they were born. Bloodletters lined the passageways in ranks, trembling with the need to kill and the greater need to witness. At the heart of the fortress, beyond halls where the skulls of worlds formed walls, beyond bridges arched over bloodfalls, beyond gates guarded by monsters whose names were wounds in the warp, the shadow of the skull throne pressed upon existence. Skulltaker did not look upon Khorne as mortals imagined gods were seen. There was no face for the sane mind to hold. There was no kindly form, no voice clothed in thundered language for priests to misunderstand. There was only immensity, red, brass, rage, a pressure before which mountains would have knelt if mountains possessed marrow. The will of the blood god filled the chamber until every skull upon every spike seemed to turn toward the herald carrying tribute. Skulltaker laid the sacks down. The first split open across the brass floor. Skulls rolled out in a clattering flood. Some were raw bone. Some were still wrapped in helms. Some smoked with psychic residue. Some bore tusks, crowns, implants, war paint, scars, metal jaws, gemstones, cracked visors or devotional inscriptions. The second sack followed, then the third, then the fourth. A tide of trophies spread before the unseen enormity of the throne. The cohort watched. Kultiran prowled the edge of the chamber, nostrils flaring, scraping one horn along a pillar carved from demon skulls. No handler restrained him. No herald dared command him. The beast belonged to violence, and violence had brought him there. Khorne took his due. The act was not gentle. Brass spikes erupted from the floor, impaling skull after skull, lifting them into the smoky air. The chosen offerings rose toward the walls and towers of the citadel, joining the impossible multitudes displayed for the blood god's satisfaction. The skulls of unworthy commanders were taken. The skulls of failed kings were taken. The skulls of broken warlords and arrogant butchers were taken. Their dead faces vanished into the fortress, becoming another fragment of its endless testimony. Yet not all were taken away. The greatest returned. They fell back before Skulltaker, each one landing without breaking, each one marked by the attention of the blood god. Grey Knight skulls struck the floor with the sound of struck bells, their silver helms cracked, their sanctified words burned black. Grim Snag Urk's massive skull rolled to a stop against Skulltaker's foot, iron jaw open in a dead snarl that still tasted of laughter. The Eldari exarch skulls gathered in a pale crescent, light and sorrowful, spirit echoes shivering through the bone. Vane's skull, still locked in the remains of its relic helm, lay dark and heavy with mortal hatred. Skulltaker knelt only to work. There was no reverence in the mortal sense, no softness, no prayer formed from need. This was craft as right as violence. He took sinew from the dead, long cords cured in blood and warp heat. He pierced bone with claws and blade tip. He threaded skulls into place across the mantle that hung from him, binding them into the cloak of skulls. Each worthy trophy found its place by instinct and judgment, not decoration, not ornament, a record, a warning, a promise. The skulls were not silent. Malchior Voss still defied in the hollow behind his broken visor. Orintane whispered banishment words that died before they could fully form. Severin Cord's bare skull seemed to glare without eyes, stubborn even in trophyhood. Grim Snag Urk laughed in a deep, broken echo, not in mockery alone, but in the remembered joy of a battle that had lasted from day into night and bled into dawn. Calthier of the Crimson Shrine mourned with a silence sharper than speech, his final denial clinging to the bone like a wound that refused closure. Dregor Vane hated. The mortal warlord's skull hated endlessly, uselessly, still crowned by the ruin of pride. Skulltaker listened to none of them as counsel. He wore them as proof. When the cloak was complete, it whispered around him with every movement, not with one voice, but with many. Defiance, rage, sorrow, laughter, hatred, broken faith, failed courage. It was a choir of the slain, bound not to praise him, but to bear witness that he had found them worthy enough to take. Satisfaction did not come. Khorne's favour was not rest. The pressure of the throne sharpened him. It passed through his blade, through his horns, through the cloak, through every wound and every trophy. It did not say enough. That word had no place beneath the brass sky. Enough was a lie spoken by the weak when their hunger died. The blood god's will demanded continuation. Each skull taken revealed the next absence. Each champion slain made the universe larger, not smaller. There were always more throats, more blades, more prideful warriors standing atop heaps of their own victories, unaware that every triumph only raised them high enough for Skulltaker to see. The cohort of blood lowered themselves around him, not kneeling as mortals knelt. Mortals knelt to beg, to worship, to survive, to pretend humility might shield them from wrath. The cohort folded into violent readiness, blades across their thighs, claws dug into the floor, bodies trembling as restrained slaughter. They awaited direction, the way a drawn blade awaits the wrist. No mercy, no retreat, no hunger except the one their master gave shape. If he pointed toward armies, they would drown them. If he pointed toward a gate, they would break it. If he pointed toward a champion, they would carve the road. Kultiran moved behind them through the smoke-choked passage, allowed where no less amount would ever be allowed. His horns were streaked with dried blood from worlds now far away. His hide was a map of impacts, burn marks and scars. Demons snarled from alcoves as he passed. He snarled back and struck sparks from the floor, daring any of them to test the privilege he had earned. None did. Destruction had made law around him. Then the citadel trembled, not from weakness, from a tension turning outward. Far from the realm of Khorne, beyond the screaming sea of the Immaterium, beyond warp storms and corpse-lit void lanes, a new war ignited. Real space shivered around a crusade fleet burning into the dark. Imperial warships translated from the warp in ranks of iron and sanctified arrogance, their prows carved with aquillas, their gun decks loaded, their holds swollen with regiments, armored companies, priests, penal battalions, siege engines, and transhuman warriors clad in ceramite. At their heart marched a space marine champion whose name had begun to gather weight. He had slain demons. He had broken warbands. He had stood beneath falling cathedrals and lived. His brothers called him unyielding. His enemies called him butcher. His skull had begun to matter. Elsewhere, an Orc empire roared itself awake beneath a war moon. Elsewhere, a Necron pharaoh stirred in his tomb palace, ancient pride returning like cold fire to a mind older than mankind's myths. Elsewhere, a tyrant raised a blade and believed no god could reach him. Skulltaker felt them all as sparks against the dark. One burned brighter. The Slayer sword ignited in his grasp, its edge drinking the chamber's red glow. The cloak of skulls whispered louder, grey night defiance scraping against orc laughter, Eldari sorrow coiling around mortal hate. The brass citadel's gates groaned open in the distance, though no demon hand touched them. A wound in reality tore itself wide before him, ragged, red and hungry, showing a battlefield beneath alien stars where men were already dying by the thousand, and commanders still believed command mattered. Skulltaker stepped forward. The cohort rose behind him as one red tide. Kultiran lowered his head and pawed the floor, carving trenches in brass, furnace breath blasting through clenched teeth. Beyond the rift, guns thundered. Vox channels screamed, Prayers rose to the corpse god. Challenges were spoken by throats not yet aware that their final words had begun. Skulltaker crossed the threshold. Slayer sword burning, cloak of skulls whispering against his back. The universe remembered, as it always remembered when the red wound opened and the executioner came through. Blood was owed. Skulls must be taken.